Welcome back. What you're about to hear aren't just stories, they're memories, echoing through the fog of war. Before we begin, like the video, subscribe and tell me where are you from and what time are you watching. Now, get comfortable. The rain is already falling, and the stories are on their way. Major Grigory Boyarinov, 37 years old, Alfa Group, KGB Special Forces, born in Moscow, Russia. The Taj Beg Palace loomed above us, its white walls glowing faintly in the winter twilight of December 27, 1979. Our 10-man team was spread out along the hillside in prone positions, observing the Afghan Presidential Guard patrolling the perimeter. I pressed my face into the cold earth, the smell of frost-killed grass filling my nostrils as I counted. The guards through my night vision device, 27 visible, though intelligence suggested over 100 more inside. My breath formed small clouds in the bitter air as I turned to my deputy, Captain Polyakov, and nodded once. It was time. All units, synchronize watches. Her hour and 18 minutes, I whispered into my radio. Acknowledgements came back from the other Alpha Group teams, as well as from our Zenith Group counterparts and the paratroopers of the 345th Independent Guards Airborne Regiment who would create our outer security perimeter. Operation Storm 333 was about to begin. My finger traced the detonator wire running down the hillside to the pre-planted charges along the palace's communications center. In these final moments of quiet, the weight of what we were about to do settled heavily on my shoulders. Tonight, we would assassinate President Hafizullah Amin and install Babrak Karmal as Afghanistan's new leader. Tonight, we would commit the Soviet Union to a war that I suspected, as Alexander the Great and the British Empire had discovered before us, might become our own imperial grave. The radio crackled. Thunder positions ready. Lightning elements. In position, I keyed my microphone. Storm elements ready. Execute in 10 minutes. As I stared at the palace, I couldn't help but think of the British retreat from Kabul in 1842. Nearly 16,000 soldiers and civilians slaughtered in the mountain passes as they attempted to flee this unforgiving land. History had a way of repeating itself here, and tonight we were writing its newest chapter. The operation had been planned with typical Soviet thoroughness, though the secrecy was extraordinary even by KGB standards. 3 days earlier, on December 24th, I had been summoned to a secure briefing room in Moscow. General Drozdov himself had outlined the mission, codenamed Operation Storm 333. The political situation in Afghanistan had deteriorated, with President Amin proving increasingly difficult to control. The Politburo had decided a change in leadership was necessary. Major Boyarinov, you will command the Alpha Group team tasked with neutralizing the palace security and capturing Amin, Drozdov explained, his finger tracing the blueprint of Taj Beg Palace spread across the table. Speed and surprise are essential. Any prolonged engagement will result in failure. The plan was elegant in its brutality. We would deploy multiple Special Forces teams to capture key facilities in Kabul simultaneously. My Alpha Group team, along with elements of the Zenith Group, would assault the palace itself. The 345th Airborne would secure the perimeter and prevent reinforcements from reaching the palace. Meanwhile, the 103rd Guards Airborne Division would secure Kabul Airport and other strategic locations throughout the city. What about Amin himself? I asked. Drozdov's expression remained neutral. Official mission parameters state he is to be captured alive if possible. However, the Politburo understands the challenges of such operations. If he resists, or if the situation becomes complicated, alternative outcomes are acceptable. I understood the euphemism. Amin was not expected to survive the night. We deployed to Bagram Air Base the following day, our equipment packed in unmarked containers. Our cover story, even to most of the Soviet forces already in Afghanistan, was that we were a communications unit. Only those directly involved in the operation knew its true purpose. The Alpha operators selected for the mission were our best, men like Captain Polyakov, a veteran of multiple operations in Prague, Lieutenant Fedorov, our communications specialist, and Sergeant Kuznetsov, whose marksmanship was legendary within the unit. Each had been chosen not only for their skills, but for their absolute reliability. This mission could not afford even a single hesitation. At Bagram, we were joined by Colonel Kolesnik, the overall commander of the operation, who provided final intelligence updates. Amin had recently moved from the presidential palace in central Kabul to the more defensible Tajbeg Palace on the outskirts of the city. The palace was heavily guarded by the presidential brigade, loyal troops equipped with tanks, armored personnel, carriers, and heavy weapons. We'll be outnumbered at least 10 to 1, Kolesnik acknowledged. But we'll have surprise. The assault will begin with the neutralization of communications, followed by a coordinated attack from multiple directions. What he didn't say, but we all understood, was that this mission marked the beginning of a direct Soviet military intervention in Afghanistan. The implications were enormous. The potential for international condemnation, the risk of turning Afghanistan into a proxy battlefield between East and West, the commitment of Soviet forces to an undefined conflict with no clear exit strategy. I thought of the British in the 19th century, their armies broken in these same mountains despite being the world's predominant military power. I thought of Alexander's Macedonians, forced to fight village by village across this land over 2,000 years earlier. But such historical reflections had no place in operational planning. We were soldiers, and we had our orders. On December 27th, we infiltrated our positions around the palace as darkness fell. Alpha and Zenith operators, dressed in Afghan army uniforms, approached in vehicles stolen from the Afghan military. The paratroopers of the 345th established blocking positions on the roads leading to the palace. Meanwhile, our forward observation team, which I now led, had been in position since midday, watching guard rotations and identifying key defensive positions. As 1930 hours approached, H hour, I observed the palace through my night vision device one final time. The Afghan guards were relaxed. Many gathered around small fires to ward off the winter chill. They had no reason to suspect that their president's closest ally was about to become his executioner. All teams, I whispered into my radio, commence. Operation Storm 333. The night exploded into chaos. The first explosion severed the palace's communication lines, followed immediately by the detonation of charges along the perimeter. The thunder of RPGs and the staccato of automatic weapons fire erupted as our main assault teams breached the outer defenses. I led my team down the hillside at a sprint, firing my AKS-74U at the confused guards who were desperately trying to establish defensive positions. "Left flank machine gun nest," shouted Polyakov, dropping to one knee and firing a precise burst that silenced the position. We reached the palace wall, where Sergeant Kuznetsov was already placing breaching charges on a service door. The explosion blew the door inward, and we entered in practiced formation, 2 men covering each direction, moving with the coordinated precision that countless drills had burned into our muscle memory. Inside, the palace was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms. Gunfire echoed from multiple directions as other teams encountered resistance. We moved rapidly toward our primary objective, the presidential apartments on the second floor. "Contact front!" yelled Lieutenant Fedorov as 3 presidential guards appeared at the end of the corridor. In the confined space, the firefight was deafening. I felt a bullet tug at my sleeve as I returned fire. The guards fell in seconds, but the noise had alerted others to our presence. "Move faster!" I ordered, knowing that speed was now more critical than stealth. We reached the main staircase, which was being defended by a determined group of guards. Captain Polyakov tossed a grenade, the explosion temporarily clearing the way as we charged up the stairs, firing continuously to keep the defenders' heads down. At the top, I took a moment to check our status. Fedorov had a graze wound on his cheek, and Kuznetsov was breathing heavily from the exertion, but everyone was operational. "Amin's quarters should be at the end of this corridor," I said, consulting the mental map I had memorized from the blueprints. Automatic weapons fire erupted from the direction of our objective. Through my night vision goggles, I could see multiple defenders taking cover behind furniture barricades they had hastily erected. "Flash and clear," I ordered. 2 stun grenades sailed down the corridor, their explosions followed by our coordinated assault. The defending guards, momentarily disoriented, were neutralized quickly, but not before one of them managed to fire a burst that caught Sergeant Petrov in the chest. He collapsed without a sound, the first casualty in our team. There was no time to check on him. We pressed on to the ornate double doors that intelligence had identified as the entrance to Amin's personal apartments. Kuznetsov placed breaching charges while the rest of us prepared for entry. 3, 2, 1, he counted down, and the doors blew inward in a shower of splinters and dust. We entered to find a surprisingly domestic scene thrown into chaos by our violent arrival. A dining table was set with a half-finished meal. A television was playing a Soviet ballet. And there, in the center of the room, was President Hafizullah Amin himself, surrounded by his family and several aides, looking stunned by the intrusion. "What is happening?" he demanded in Russian, his face a mixture of confusion and outrage. "I am the president. I called the Soviet Union for help." The tragic irony of his statement was not lost on me. Amin had indeed requested Soviet military assistance against the growing insurgency in his country. What he didn't know was that Moscow had determined he was the problem that needed to be solved. "Secure the room," I ordered, deliberately ignoring Amin's question. My men moved efficiently, disarming the aides and separating Amin from his family. One of the aides made a sudden move, reaching inside his jacket. Lieutenant Guskov, reacting instantly, fired a single shot that dropped the man to the floor. Amin's wife screamed and his children began crying in terror. "Everyone on the ground, hands where I can see them," I shouted, needing to regain control of the situation. Amin, still standing, glared at me with growing comprehension. "The Soviet Union," he said slowly, "has betrayed me." Before I could respond, gunfire erupted from an adjoining room. One of Amin's bodyguards, hidden from our initial sweep, opened fire with a concealed weapon. In the ensuing chaos, multiple shots were fired. When the shooting stopped seconds later, the bodyguard was dead, but so was President Amin, slumped, in his chair with 3 bullet wounds to his chest. I keyed my radio. "Falcon to command. Package secured. Repeat, package secured." The euphemism was clear to all involved. Amin had been eliminated. "Understood, Falcon." "Hold position until relief arrives," came the response from Colonel Kolesnik. While we secured the room and provided first aid to Amin's wounded family members, I heard over the radio that our other objectives throughout Kabul had been similarly accomplished. The Zenith Group had captured the Ministry of Interior. The 345th had secured the radio station and was broadcasting pre-recorded announcements from Babrak Karmal, announcing himself as Afghanistan's new leader. The 103rd Guards Airborne Division had control of all major intersections and government buildings in the city. Operation Storm 333 had succeeded in its immediate objectives. In less than 45 minutes, we had decapitated the Afghan government and prepared the way for a new, more compliant regime. The surgical precision of the operation would later be studied in special forces training programs worldwide. But as we waited for our relief to arrive, I looked at the body of Hafizullah Amin, the man who had trusted Moscow enough to invite Soviet troops into his country, only to be killed by those same troops, and felt a sense of foreboding. We had crossed a threshold tonight, committing ourselves to direct involvement in Afghanistan's internal affairs. The historical parallels were impossible to ignore. 30 minutes later, the palace was secure. Soviet and Afghan officers loyal to Babrak Karmal moved through the rooms, establishing order and preparing for the new administration. I led my remaining team members outside, where the cold night air was filled with the sound of helicopter rotors as reinforcements continued to arrive. Colonel Kolesnik approached me, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Excellent work, Major. Moscow is pleased." I nodded, acknowledging the compliment while looking past him to the city of Kabul spread out below the palace. Already I could see tracer fire in several districts as pockets of resistance were engaged by our forces. "What happens now, Colonel?" I asked. Kolesnik followed my gaze to the city. "Now, we pacify any resistance, install Karmal's government, and stabilize the situation. A few weeks of operations, perhaps a month or two at most." I said nothing, but I thought of the British general who, in 1839, had similarly believed that occupying Kabul would be sufficient to control Afghanistan. 3 years later, his entire force was annihilated trying to retreat through the Khyber Pass. "The Americans will respond," I said finally. "They won't allow us to have Afghanistan without a fight, even if it's by proxy." Kolesnik shrugged. "Let them try. This is our backyard, not theirs." As dawn broke over Kabul on December 28, 1979, the Soviet flag flew over Tajbeg Palace. Operation Storm 333 was officially complete, and the Afghanistan war in Afghanistan had officially begun. We had accomplished our mission with precision and minimal losses, a testament to the capabilities of our special forces. But as our helicopter lifted off from the palace grounds, carrying us back to Bagram, I could not shake the feeling that we had just committed ourselves to a conflict that would not be resolved by special operations or conventional military tactics. We had entered the graveyard of empires, a land that had broken the will of conquerors since before the time of Christ. History did not favor those who sought to impose their will on Afghanistan by force. Only time would tell if the Soviet Union would be the empire that finally broke the pattern, or if we too would eventually join the ranks of those who had come before us, leaving only our dead buried in Afghanistan's unforgiving soil. Captain Mikhail Vetrov, 29, 335th Independent Helicopter Regiment, born in Pskov, Russia. The Mi-24V shuddered violently as another RPG streaked past our starboard side, missing by less than 5 meters. I felt my gunner Sergei tense beside me as he swung the 12.7mm Yakushev-Borzov machine gun, mounted in the nose turret toward the ridgeline, his breath steady in my headset despite the chaos. The narrow valley had suddenly erupted with muzzle flashes from at least a dozen positions. 2 o'clock, 800 meters, rock outcropping, I called out to Sergei as I banked the helicopter hard right, the G-forces pressing me against the armored seat. Our wingman, Lieutenant Baranov's Hind, was already engaging targets at our 9, his 30mm cannon thumping rhythmically as orange tracers carved through the morning haze. The distinctive whine of our turbo shafts echoed off the valley walls as I pushed the helicopter into a tight combat maneuver, the aircraft's 8.6 metric tons straining against the thin mountain air of the Hindu Kush. "Target acquired," Sergei responded flatly, before unleashing a barrage from our 12.7mm Yakushev-Borzov machine gun. Through the armored glass, I watched his rounds walk directly into the enemy position, sending rock fragments and dust skyward. We had been ambushed, and now we would respond with overwhelming firepower, the only language that seemed universally understood in this godforsaken country. Operation Mountain Storm had begun 3 days earlier, on April 14, 1985. The first 2 days had been spent securing the primary landing zones and conducting reconnaissance flights to map enemy positions throughout the valley. Our intelligence officers had identified several Mujahideen supply routes. Based on these initial flights, now on day 3, we were transitioning to direct action phase, providing close air support for a convoy of the 103rd Guards Airborne Division moving through the Kunar Valley toward the Pakistani border. Back at base during our pre-mission briefing, Colonel Tamarov had emphasized the strategic importance of Operation Mountain Storm. "The Americans have escalated their involvement," he'd explained, pointing to intelligence photos of weapon caches. "CIA operatives are training Mujahideen fighters in camps just across the Pakistani border, and these weapons are finding their way into Massoud's hands. This operation isn't just about securing a road, it's about disrupting the supply chain that's costing us helicopters and men." What he didn't say, but all of us understood, was that 1985 marked a turning point in the war. The initial Soviet advantage was eroding as sophisticated Western technology flowed into Afghanistan through the porous Pakistani border. Intelligence reported that Ahmad Shah Massoud's fighters had been receiving substantial arms shipments, including American Stinger missiles through mountain passes in this sector. Our orders were clear: locate and destroy enemy positions before they could threaten the convoy or establish positions along the route. We took off from the airbase at Jalalabad at 0530 hours in a flight of 4 Mi-24Vs, call signs, Hammer 1 through Hammer 4, accompanied by 2 Mi-8 transports carrying a quick reaction force of Spetsnaz troops. The jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush gleamed in the early morning sun as we gained altitude, their beauty belying the danger that lurked within their folds. Hammer flight, maintain heading 087, altitude 2,200 meters. Patrol sector Gamma 6 for hostile activity. The controller's voice crackled over the radio. I acknowledged the transmission and glanced at my navigation map, checking the fuel calculations I'd made during pre-flight. At our current consumption rate, we had approximately 2 hours of loiter time before needing to return to base. Mikhail, think we'll see any action today? Sergei asked over the intercom. After 14 months of deployment, he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to predict which missions would bring contact. The Americans have been flooding the northern valleys with weapons. If intelligence is accurate, we'll earn our pay today, I replied, scanning the ridgelines through my polarized visor. Sergei had been my gunner since I'd arrived in Afghanistan. He was from Novgorod, a quiet man with a wife and young daughter waiting for him back home. Unlike many of the younger crew members who still harbored romantic notions of combat, Sergei approached each mission with the mechanical precision of a man who understood exactly what was at stake. We had been flying at 140 knots for approximately 40 minutes when Hammer 3 reported movement at the mouth of a narrow tributary valley. Hammer 1, this is Hammer 3. Multiple heat signatures detected in the ravine at coordinates 35.14 north, 71.24 east. Approximately 10 to 15 personnel with pack animals. Copy that, Hammer 3. All units, form up on my lead. We'll make a single pass for visual confirmation before engaging, I responded, banking the helicopter toward the reported position. The Mi-24V responded immediately to my control inputs, its contra-rotating main rotor giving it handling characteristics unlike any other helicopter in our arsenal. The cockpit vibrated with the raw power of the twin Isotov turboshafts, the sound penetrating even our insulated flight helmets. The smell of hydraulic fluid, hot metal, and sweat created the familiar cockpit atmosphere that had become our second home over these long months of combat operations. As we approached the coordinates, I dropped altitude to 1,800 meters, using a ridgeline to mask our approach. The valley below was typical of the region, a narrow floor with steep rocky walls rising to heights of over 3,000 meters. Perfect terrain for an ambush, which is exactly why we maintained our altitude advantage. As we climbed toward the higher elevations, I felt the helicopter struggling against the physics of high-altitude flight. The Mi-24's impressive firepower came at the cost of weight, nearly 12 tons fully loaded, which made it vulnerable in the thin mountain air above 3,000 meters. The Mujahideen had learned this limitation quickly, often positioning their heaviest weapons at elevations where our performance margins narrowed dangerously. What our design engineers in Mills' Moscow bureaus hadn't fully appreciated was how the Hindu Kush's combination of extreme altitudes, unpredictable wind shear, and temperature variations could transform our aerial predator into vulnerable prey. Visual confirmation. Hammer 1, called Lieutenant Baranov from Hammer 2. 15+ combatants with mules. Heavy weapons visible. All units, weapons free, I ordered, selecting the 30mm cannon on my weapons panel. Hammer 3 and 4, take the southern end of the column. Hammer 2, you're with me on the northern section. Execute on my mark. I pushed the cyclic forward, dropping the nose of the Hind as we accelerated to attack speed. The landscape blurred beneath us as we rushed toward the target at over 150 knots. The element of surprise was total. By the time the Mujahideen sentries had heard our approach, 4 attack helicopters were bearing down on their position. Engaging, I announced calmly, squeezing the trigger on the cyclic. The helicopter shuddered as the 30mm cannon unleashed its fury, the heavy rounds tearing into the unprepared column. Dust and debris erupted where the rounds impacted, and I could see figures scattering for cover. Sergei joined with the Yakushev Borzov, adding to the devastating fusillade. Hammer 2 followed directly behind us, focusing on a group attempting to set up what appeared to be a DSHK heavy machine gun Their position disappeared in a cloud of dust and flame as Lieutenant Baranov launched an S-8 rocket directly into their midst. We pulled up sharply at the end of our attack run, climbing to avoid the terrain while banking hard to starboard for another pass. Through the clearing dust, I could see several figures running for a nearby cave entrance. Hammer 1 to all units. Multiple targets seeking cover in cave system at northeastern end of valley. Hammer 3 and 4, maintain suppression fire. Hammer 2, follow me for rocket run. I selected the S-8 rocket pods on the weapons panel and adjusted our approach vector for optimal firing angle. The targeting reticle in my HUD aligned with the cave entrance as we came around for the second pass. Firing, I stated, releasing a pair of rockets that streaked toward the target. The 80mm rockets detonated with a flash visible, even in the bright morning sun, collapsing the cave entrance in a shower of rock and debris. Hammer 2 followed with another volley, ensuring that particular escape route was permanently sealed. As we completed our second pass, the radio crackled with an urgent transmission from base command. All Hammer units be advised, convoy Alpha 7 is under heavy attack at coordinates 35.22 north, 71.36 east. Immediate air support requested. Copy that command. Hammer flight inbound, I responded, already plotting the new coordinates on my navigation system. The attack position was approximately 12 kilometers northeast of our current position. Less than 4 minutes of flight. Time. Sergei, check ammunition status, I ordered as we turned toward the new target area. 30mm at 65%, 12.7mm at 70%, rockets at 80%. We're in good shape, he replied, his voice maintaining that professional calm that I'd come to rely on. As we approached the embattled convoy, the situation became immediately clear. A company-sized element of the 103rd was pinned down in a narrow section of road by heavy fire from elevated positions on both sides of the valley. 2 BTR-70 armored personnel carriers were burning, and the troops had established a hasty defensive perimeter using the remaining vehicles. Command, this is Hammer 1. Visual confirmation of convoy Alpha 7 under attack. Engaging hostile positions, I radioed, then switched to the convoy's frequency. Alpha 7, this is Hammer Flight. Mark your positions with smoke. Over. Within seconds, several purple smoke grenades blossomed among the Soviet positions, the vibrant smoke visible even against the dusty backdrop of the valley. Hammer Flight, multiple enemy positions in the ridgelines to north and south, heavy machine guns and RPGs, responded a stressed voice from the ground commander. Copy that, Alpha 7. Keep your heads down. We're coming in hot. I divided our flight. Hammer 3 and 4, take the southern ridge. Hammer 2, you're with me on the northern positions. The 4 helicopters split into their assigned elements, each focusing on their designated targets. The northern ridgeline was dotted with Mujahideen fighting positions, expertly camouflaged among the rocks but now revealed by their muzzle flashes. I initiated our attack run, coming in at an oblique angle to minimize exposure to ground fire while maximizing our weapons coverage. Multiple RPG teams at your 2 o'clock 800 meters, Sergei called out, already engaging with the 12.7mm machine gun. I squeezed the trigger, sending a stream of 30mm rounds into the position, then followed with a rocket that detonated among a cluster of fighters attempting to relocate. The ridgeline erupted in secondary explosions, ammunition cooking off from our direct hits. As we completed our first pass, a streak of light flashed from the ridgeline. An RPG launched at our aircraft. I banked hard left, the G-forces pressing me into my seat as the rocket passed harmlessly beneath our fuselage. That was close, Sergei muttered, already focusing on the origin point of the RPG and responding with sustained fire from our Yakushev Borzov. For the next 20 minutes, we executed a series of coordinated attacks on the enemy positions, systematically neutralizing their heavy weapons. The tide of the battle turned quickly. The devastating firepower of 4 Mi-24s was simply too much for even the most determined fighters to withstand. Hammer 1, this is Alpha 7. Enemy fire diminishing on northern ridge. We're organizing a counterattack to clear remaining positions. Copy that, Alpha 7. We'll provide covering fire, I responded, bringing us around for another pass to suppress any remaining resistance. As the ground forces began their advance up the slopes, we maintained a protective circle above them, ready to engage any targets of opportunity. The Mi-8s that had accompanied our flight landed in a small clearing behind the convoy's position to evacuate the wounded and deliver fresh ammunition. By 0920, the immediate threat had been neutralized. The convoy's commander reported 7 KIA and 15 wounded, significant losses, but far fewer than would have occurred without our intervention. We remained on station until 10:45 when a relief flight arrived to take our place, our fuel reserves approaching the minimum required for return to base. The flight back to Jalalabad was conducted in relative silence, each crew member processing the morning's events in their own way. As we approached the airbase, I could see the maintenance crews already assembled on the tarmac, ready to rearm and refuel our aircraft for the next mission. After landing, I completed the shutdown, checklist mechanically, my mind still partially in the mountains. As the turbines spooled down, the sudden absence of their constant whine was almost disorienting. I removed my helmet and wiped the sweat from my brow, the cockpit having become oppressively hot in the late morning sun. Sergei and I climbed down from the helicopter, our flight suits darkened with sweat. The maintenance chief approached with his clipboard, eager to get our report on the aircraft's performance and any issues we'd encountered. "Any problems I should know about, Captain?" he asked, his eyes already scanning the helicopter's exterior for damage. Handling was sluggish at high altitude, particularly when fully loaded. "Might need to check the trim system," I replied, running my hand along a new set of bullet holes in the fuselage. "And we'll need some patching here." The chief nodded, making notes on his clipboard. "I'll have her ready for tomorrow's mission. The colonel wants all crews for briefing at 1600 hours. Apparently there's a major operation being planned." I nodded and walked with Sergei toward the debriefing room, our boots kicking up dust on the tarmac. Another crew was all ready, preparing for takeoff, their Mi-24 undergoing final checks before yet another mission into the mountains. "Think we made a difference today?" Sergei asked quietly as we watched the other helicopter lift off, its distinctive silhouette powerful against the blue sky. I considered his question, thinking of the convoy we'd saved and the fighters we'd eliminated. But I also thought of the endless mountains stretching to the horizon, hiding thousands more fighters with an endless supply of weapons flowing in from Pakistan, funded by American dollars. "Today? Yes," I finally answered. "Tomorrow? We'll do it all again." As we entered the debriefing room, I glanced at the large map on the wall, pin-marked with the locations of recent engagements. The pins formed a dense cluster throughout. The mountains, a visual representation of our squadron's work over the past year. Yet the insurgency showed no signs of weakening. For every position we destroyed, 2 more appeared elsewhere. The technical superiority of our Mi-24s was undeniable. Nothing the Mujahideen had could match our firepower or our capability to strike and vanish. But they had something perhaps more valuable: time and terrain. This was their home, and they could afford to wait us out, fighting their war of attrition, one ambush, one convoy, one helicopter at a time. I recorded our mission details in the squadron logbook: ammunition expended, targets engaged, fuel consumed. The technical accounting of warfare that would be sent back to Moscow as evidence of our progress. But the true measure of our accomplishment, or lack thereof, couldn't be captured in such reports. What I wouldn't include in my report was the momentary glimpse I'd had of a fighter's face before our rocket struck his position. He couldn't have been more than 16, yet he'd handled his weapon with the confidence of a veteran. Nor would I mention how these fighters used the terrain with an intimacy no satellite map or reconnaissance photo could ever capture. Our technology could deliver devastation with clinical precision from a safe distance, but they fought with the desperate commitment of men defending their homeland. This wasn't a conventional enemy that could be defeated through conventional means, no matter how technically superior our equipment might be. Our Mi-24s represented the pinnacle of Soviet military aviation, armored beasts with awesome firepower that could deliver destruction with impunity from above. Yet, for all their technological sophistication, they were ultimately just machines, tools in a conflict that was being decided by human will and cultural determination that no engineer in Moscow could quantify or counter. Tomorrow we would fly, again, our Mi-24s carrying their lethal payload into the mountains. And somewhere in those same mountains, more fighters would be waiting, their tactics evolving, their resolve undiminished. It was a technical problem without a technical solution, a reality that no amount of firepower seemed able to change. Sergeant Viktor Petrenko, 28, 22nd Special Purpose Brigade, GRU Spetsnaz, born in Sevastopol, Crimean Oblast. The scope's cold metal pressed against my cheekbone as I controlled my breathing. 300 meters below, 5 Mujahideen fighters gathered around a small fire, passing a tin kettle between them. Through my PSO-1 scope, I could make out their beards, their pockholes, the AKs resting across their laps. The wind whispered, through the rocky outcroppings around me, carrying the faint scent of their tea. My finger rested alongside the SVD's trigger guard, not on the trigger itself. Not yet. My spotter Mikhail shifted slightly beside me, pebbles crunching under his weight. I froze. Down below, one of the fighters, the one with the red checkered keffiyeh, stood suddenly, scanning the ridgeline. I stopped breathing. Movement. 60 degrees east, Mikhail whispered, barely audible over my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Multiple hostiles, advancing in our direction. We were compromised. 3 days earlier, Command had briefed us on Operation Falcon, an intelligence-gathering mission deep in Kunar province. American-supplied Stinger missiles had begun appearing in this region, taking down our Mi-24s, with alarming frequency. Our 8-man Spetsnaz team was tasked with identifying supply routes and possibly eliminating high-value targets of opportunity. Captain Sokolov spread the topographical map across the plywood table in our forward operating base near Asadabad. Recent intelligence suggests Mujahideen commanders are gathering here. His nicotine-stained finger tapped a valley intersection, planning a major offensive against the 860th Separate Motor Rifle Regiment. American advisors. Lieutenant Baranov asked, scratching his 3-day stubble. Unconfirmed but probable. CIA involvement has increased since the Stingers started arriving. Sokolov's face betrayed nothing, but we all understood the implications. American involvement meant better equipment, better intelligence, and more danger for us. Insertion by Mi-8 at 0200 hours, Sokolov continued. Weather forecast shows a new moon, cloud cover at 60%, temperatures dropping to -5 Celsius in the highlands. You'll establish an observation post here. He pointed to a ridge overlooking the valley, and maintain surveillance for 72 hours before extraction. I studied the map carefully. The extraction point was 15 kilometers from the observation post, a grueling march through enemy territory if something went wrong. Something always went wrong in Afghanistan. Petrenko and Mikhail will operate as our sniper team, Sokolov said, glancing at me. The rest of us will establish security and gather signals intelligence. Questions? No one spoke. We'd been in Afghanistan long enough to know that questions rarely had satisfying answers. At 0130, we performed our final equipment checks in the muted red glow of the hangar lights. My SVD Dragunov felt reassuring in my hands. A consistent companion through 3 deployments. Alongside standard issue gear, I carried 2 extra magazines for my AKS-74U, 800 grams of C4 explosive, a PNV-57E night vision device, 7 days of rations, and 4 liters of water. Too much weight for a rapid retreat, but too little for comfort. Our Mi-8 lifted off at exactly 0200 hours, banking hard to the southeast after clearing the base perimeter. The crew chief, a sallow-faced Ukrainian who couldn't have been older than 20, gave us a thumbs up as we donned our night vision. No one spoke during the flight. Some men prayed silently. I simply stared at the topographical map, memorizing escape routes and water sources. At 0243, the helicopter slowed, hovering 10 meters above a small clearing. We fast roped down in practiced sequence. 4 men, equipment packages, 4 more men. The Mi-8 disappeared into the night sky before my boots even settled in the loose scree. Around us, the Hindu Kush mountains loomed like ancient giants, indifferent to our presence. "Move out," Sokolov whispered into his throat mic. Standard. Formation, 10-meter intervals. We advanced through the darkness, our night vision transforming the landscape into a ghostly green panorama. The American equipment the Mujahideen now possessed was concerning, but most fighters still relied primarily on their uncanny knowledge of the terrain and their seemingly supernatural ability to move through it silently. We moved cautiously, placing each footstep deliberately, scanning constantly for signs of enemy presence. 3 hours later, we reached our observation post, a rocky outcropping with clear sightlines to the valley below. The position offered good concealment, but limited cover from direct fire. If discovered, we'd be exposed. Petrenko, Mikhail, establish your hide, Sokolov ordered. Baranov, signals intelligence. The rest of you, security perimeter. Radio check every hour. Strictly listen only, unless emergency protocols are initiated. Mikhail and I spent 40 minutes constructing our sniper hide, blending the position with the surrounding terrain. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten as we finished, that dangerous time when night vision becomes a hindrance, but normal. Vision hasn't yet adjusted. The most dangerous time for soldiers operating in hostile territory. Below us, the valley remained quiet as dawn broke. A small village of perhaps 20 compounds sat nestled against the southern slope. Smoke from morning fires curled lazily into the sky. An old man herded goats along a worn path. 3 children drew water from a well. Peaceful, Mikhail murmured beside me. I grunted non-committally. Afghanistan had taught me that peaceful was merely the pause between bullets. By mid-afternoon, I'd cataloged the routine movements in the village. The children playing near the well, the women hanging laundry, the old men gathering to smoke and talk. Nothing unusual. Nothing to suggest this was a staging ground for Mujahideen operations. Movement, northwest ridge, Mikhail whispered, suddenly adjusting his binoculars. Single file, approximately 12 fighters. I shifted my SVD, scanning through the scope. They moved with the practiced efficiency of experienced guerrillas, maintaining appropriate spacing, using terrain for concealment, stopping periodically to scan their surroundings. Their leader wore a distinctive red checkered keffiyeh. Through my scope, I could see the American M16 slung across his back. The others carried a mix of AK-47s and older Lee Enfield rifles. Mikhail keyed his radio twice, our signal to the team. Captain Sokolov crawled to our position. Moments later, 12 fighters northwest ridge moving toward the village, I reported. Leader carries American equipment, Sokolov observed through his binoculars. Identify and record. No engagement unless directly threatened. For the next several hours, we documented the comings and goings from the village. More fighters arrived in small groups. By nightfall, I'd counted 37 armed men, far more than typical for a village this size. Something was happening. Radio intercept confirms meeting of commanders, Baranov reported at 2200 hours. Referenced Eagle delivery, likely code for weapons shipment. Around midnight, 3 trucks arrived, driving without headlights along the valley road. Men unloaded wooden crates, carrying them into the largest compound. Even through my night vision, I couldn't identify the contents, but the careful handling suggested munitions. Stingers, Sokolov whispered. Has to be. Dawn of the second day brought increased activity in the village. Fighters established guard positions at key points around the perimeter. Their security protocols suggested professional training. Likely, Pakistani ISI or American advisors. At 0930, a newcomer arrived on horseback, accompanied by 4 bodyguards. The deference shown by the other fighters marked him as someone important. That's Haqqani, Sokolov hissed, suddenly tense. Jalaluddin Haqqani himself. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Haqqani was one of the most notorious Mujahideen commanders, responsible for dozens of successful operations against Soviet forces, including the downing of at least 7 helicopters in the past month alone. Confirm identification, Sokolov ordered, his voice tight with anticipation. I adjusted my scope, increasing magnification. The man dismounted, removing his pakol hat to wipe his brow. The face matched our intelligence photos. Confirmed. Jalaluddin Haqqani. Sokolov keyed his radio, speaking in rapid, hushed tones. Falcon actual to base. Priority target identified. Requesting authorization for elimination. The response came swiftly. Base to Falcon actual. Authorization granted. Confirm when complete. Sokolov turned to me, his eyes hard. Petrenko, you're cleared to engage when opportunity presents. The opportunity didn't come until late afternoon. Haqqani remained inside the main compound for hours, emerging only briefly to pray with his men. Each time he was surrounded by bodyguards, making a clean shot impossible. At 16:45, he finally appeared in a clearing between buildings, conferring with the fighter in the red keffiyeh. Range, 573 meters. Wind 8 kph from the northwest. Temperature, 14 degrees Celsius. Humidity, 35%. Elevation differential, 126 meters down. I calculated the ballistic solution, adjusting my scope accordingly. Send it when ready, Mikhail whispered, spotting through his binoculars. I inhaled deeply, then released half my breath, holding the remainder. My heartbeat slowed. The crosshairs settled on Haqqani's chest. A child ran into my sight picture, offering Haqqani a cup of tea. I hesitated. The moment passed. Haqqani moved back toward the building, bodyguards closing around him. You had the shot, Mikhail hissed. There was a child, I replied simply. Mikhail fell silent. We both knew the elimination of Haqqani could save countless Soviet lives, but some lines once crossed could never be uncrossed. The opportunity didn't present itself again that day. As darkness fell, tension within our team mounted. Our extraction was scheduled for 0300 hours, less than 8 hours away. Eliminating Haqqani before extraction remained the priority. At 2300 hours, disaster struck. One of our team members, Kuznetsov, the youngest, was spotted by a Mujahideen patrol while repositioning. Gunfire erupted, shattering the night's silence. Within seconds, the entire valley was alert. Fall back to extraction point, Sokolov ordered through the radio. Emergency protocol Alpha. Mikhail and I quickly dismantled our hide, gathering essential equipment. Below us, fighters poured from the village, spreading out in search patterns. They knew these mountains intimately. This was their home territory. We moved rapidly through the darkness, using terrain for concealment. Behind us, shouts echoed as the Mujahideen discovered our observation post. Ahead, sporadic gunfire indicated our teammates were already engaged. We need to create a diversion, I told Mikhail as we paused behind a boulder. They'll overwhelm the others before they reach the extraction point. He nodded grimly, understanding the implication. One of us would need to draw the pursuers away. I'll double back, I said, checking my AKS-74U. You rendezvous with the team. Negative, Mikhail replied. I'm lighter, faster. I'll draw them southeast. You continue northeast to the extraction point. Before I could argue, he was gone, scrambling down the rocky slope toward the false trail he intended to create. 5 minutes later, I heard him deliberately fire 3 shots into the air. Shouts erupted as the Mujahideen pursuers changed direction, following the bait. I continued alone, moving as quickly as I dared through unfamiliar terrain. The extraction point was still 7 kilometers away. The moon had risen, casting dangerous shadows that played tricks on my eyes. Every rock seemed to move. Every shadow harbored enemies. 3 kilometers from the extraction point, I encountered 3 Mujahideen fighters establishing an ambush position along our likely route. They hadn't seen me yet. I could bypass them, but that would leave them in position to ambush my teammates. I set up my SVD, controlling my breathing despite the urgency. 3 shots. 3 bodies collapsed. I was moving again before the echoes faded, knowing the gunfire would attract attention. The paranoia grew with each passing minute. Eyes watching from every shadow. The sensation of crosshairs on my back. The certainty that each step might trigger a mine or alert a hidden observer. Afghanistan had a way of getting inside your head, making you doubt your senses, your training, even your sanity. The night seemed alive with malevolent intention. Rocks shifted underfoot at the worst moments. Branches scratched at my face, like skeletal fingers. Even the stars felt like hostile observers reporting my position to unseen enemies. I reached the extraction point at 0245, finding only Sokolov and Baranov already there. Sokolov's arm was bandaged with a field dressing dark with blood. "Kuznetsov?" I asked. Sokolov shook his head once. "Mikhail? Created a diversion. Southeast ridgeline." I didn't need to elaborate. Within 10 minutes, 2 more team members arrived, Volkov and Ivanovich, both unharmed but exhausted. No sign of the remaining men. At precisely 0300, we heard the distinctive thump of Mi-8 rotors approaching. The helicopter appeared over the ridge, flaring for landing. As we sprinted toward it, gunfire erupted from the southern slope. The Mujahideen had found us. We returned fire, covering our approach to the helicopter. The door gunner's PKM chattered, suppressing the enemy positions. I was the last to board, turning to provide covering fire as my teammates climbed in. That's when I saw him, the fighter with the red checkered keffiyeh, raising an American-made Stinger missile to his shoulder. I fired instinctively, my AKS-74U bucking against my shoulder. The distance was too great for accuracy, but the burst forced him to duck for cover, disrupting his aim. The bow Stinger launched, but the forced adjustment sent it wide, missing our helicopter by meters. The Mi-8 banked hard, gaining altitude as I continued firing until my magazine emptied. Below us, dozens of muzzle flashes illuminated the mountainside like angry fireflies. No one spoke as we thundered back toward our base. 5 empty seats spoke volumes about the mission's cost. Whether the intelligence gathered justified that, cost would be for others to decide. 2 weeks later, I learned that Mikhail had been captured alive. His fate remained unknown, though the rumors suggested Soviet prisoners rarely survived long in Mujahideen hands. Haqqani continued his operations against Soviet forces. The Stingers continued to arrive from America through Pakistani intermediaries. The war continued its grinding, merciless progression. In my dreams, I still see the fighter with the red keffiyeh, still feel the paranoia of those mountains where every shadow concealed death. Afghanistan never truly releases those who've fought in her embrace. We carry her with us even after we leave. The fear, the paranoia, the ghosts that whisper in the darkness. Some wars end when you go home. Afghanistan follows you there. Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Kuznetsov, 27, 22nd GRU Spetsnaz Brigade, born in Soviet Union. Blood trickled down my face, mixing with sweat and dust as I pressed deeper into the crevice. The rock felt cool against my cheek, a small mercy in the merciless Afghan heat. Through my PSO-1 scope, I watched the Mujahideen patrol move through the valley below. 7 men, all armed. Too many to engage alone. My spotter was dead, his body hidden 2 kilometers back, under a pile of stones. The radio was damaged in the ambush, and extraction point was a day's march away through territory controlled by Ahmad Shah Massoud's fighters. Every shadow was a threat, every sound a potential betrayal. I hadn't slept in 36 hours. The crosshairs in my scope danced slightly as my hands trembled from exhaustion. A young fighter below stopped, turning his head towards the ridge where I lay concealed. I held my breath. Had he seen me? I placed my finger on the trigger of my SVD Dragunov. If I took this shot, the others would know my position. If I didn't, and he had spotted me. 3 days earlier, our Mi-8 had dropped us at 0430 in the pre-dawn darkness on a ridge in the Panjshir Valley. The operation was classified. Intelligence had located a meeting between Massoud's commanders and CIA operatives. Our 2-man team was to provide reconnaissance, and if the opportunity presented itself, eliminate high-value targets. I was Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Kuznetsov, sniper with the 22nd Spetsnaz Brigade of the GRU. My spotter, Sergeant Anton Baranov, had been my partner for 14 months. We communicated almost without words by this point, essential for the silent work we performed. Wind from the west, 2 to 3 meters per second, Anton whispered, as we set up our position on a cliff overlooking the village where the meeting was to take place. Temperature rising quickly. Compensate for mirage by 0900. Our position was perfect. 820 meters from the target building, clear line of sight, with multiple escape routes. We had food and water for 4 days, though the mission parameters specified extraction after 48 hours. The rocky overhang provided shade and concealment. We took turns observing the village throughout the day, documenting movements, identifying sentries, and establishing patterns. Night fell, and we continued our surveillance using our NSP-2 night vision scope. The stars were brilliant in the Afghan sky, but I took no pleasure in their beauty. In Afghanistan, a clear night meant increased mujahideen activity. The darkness belonged to them. Movement. Eastern approach. Anton breathed into my ear. 3 vehicles. Land cruisers, probably. I shifted to the scope. The vehicles moved with headlights off, navigating by moonlight. They stopped 200 meters from the village and figures emerged. I counted 8 men. They carried themselves differently than the local fighters, more disciplined, purposeful. Americans, I said. Anton nodded. The intelligence was correct. We watched as the newcomers were escorted into the largest building in the village center. Our orders were to observe the meeting and report back, but also to eliminate targets of opportunity if they presented themselves. Command would be very interested to have confirmation of direct American involvement, Anton said quietly. I adjusted the focus on my scope, trying to get a clear image through the windows, but the angles were wrong. We would need to move closer. We waited until 0200 when the village was at its quietest. Moving like ghosts, we descended halfway down the ridge to a new position that gave us better visibility into the target building. The risk was calculated. Closer meant better intelligence, but also increased chance of detection. The new hide was more exposed, but provided a direct line of sight through a window. Inside, we could see 5 men around a table, 3 Afghans and 2 Westerners. Maps were spread out between them. I count 4 sentries on the perimeter, Anton whispered, scanning with his binoculars. 2 at the main entrance, 1 roving the east side, another on the roof. I focused on memorizing faces, particularly of the Americans. Our military intelligence would want detailed descriptions. One of them was clearly the leader, tall, with a strong build and confident gestures as he pointed to locations on the map. That one's CIA, I said, indicating the leader. The other might be military advisor. The meeting continued until just before dawn. As the sky began to lighten, the participants stood, shaking hands. This would be the moment of maximum visibility, taking reference photos, Anton whispered, using our specialized camera with telephoto lens. That's when everything went wrong. The camera's shutter, though quiet, was still audible in the pre-dawn stillness. The sentry on the roof turned, in our direction, raising his AK-47. I had a split second to decide. I fired. The Dragunov's report echoed across the valley as the sentry dropped. Immediately, shouts erupted from the village. "We're compromised," I hissed. "Fall back to position 3. We grabbed our essential equipment and began moving rapidly up the slope toward our emergency extraction point. Gunfire erupted behind us as Mujahideen fighters poured from buildings. The meeting participants were quickly hustled to their vehicles. "Command needs these photos," Anton said as we ran, clutching the camera. Proof of American involvement. We reached the ridgeline and continued along it, using the terrain for cover. The sound of vehicles starting reached us from below. They were giving chase. We needed to reach the designated extraction point by 0600 for our helicopter pickup. The path ahead narrowed, forcing us into a predictable route. Anton spotted it first, the telltale signs of an ambush position ahead. Rock configurations that offered too perfect cover, scuff marks in the dust where fighters had settled in to wait. "We need to go around," he said. "No time," I responded, checking my watch. Extraction in 22 minutes. We decided to split up. Anton would create a diversion while I moved through a narrow ravine to flank the ambush position. It was a textbook Spetsnaz maneuver we had practiced countless times, but never in terrain this treacherous. Anton moved ahead, deliberately making noise to draw attention. I heard the Mujahideen open fire, and Anton returned fire in controlled bursts from his AKS-74U. I used the distraction to scale the side of the ravine and come around behind the ambush position. There were 5 fighters, focused entirely on Anton's position. I eliminated 3 with my Makarov fitted with suppressor before they realized I was there. The remaining 2 turned to engage me, but it was too late. The fight was over in seconds. I signaled Anton to move up, but received no response. Moving cautiously back to his last position, I found him slumped behind a rock, blood pooling beneath him. A round had caught him in the throat just below his body armor. His eyes were still open, hand clutching the camera. "Get it back," he whispered, blood bubbling from his lips. "Show them." He didn't finish the sentence. I took the camera, his ammunition, and his identification. There was no time to bury him properly. The best I could do was conceal his body under rocks to prevent immediate discovery and desecration. The Mujahideen had a reputation for mutilating the bodies of Soviet soldiers, particularly Spetsnaz. The extraction point was a small plateau 2 kilometers ahead. I could hear the distant sound of rotors, our Mi-8 approaching on schedule. I ran, lungs burning, legs cramping from the elevation and exertion. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a Stinger missile being launched, the distinctive whoosh as it left its tube. The Americans had been supplying these to the Mujahideen through Pakistan for years, turning our helicopter operations into deadly gambles. The explosion illuminated the mountains around me. Through my binoculars, I watched in horror as our Mi-8 erupted into flames, spinning out of control before crashing into the mountainside a kilometer away. There would be no extraction. I was alone, deep in enemy territory, with intelligence that could confirm what Moscow had long suspected: direct American involvement in training and equipping Massoud's fighters. The radio crackled with static when I tried to establish communication with base. The fall during the ambush had damaged it. I could receive broken transmissions but couldn't send. Through fragments of communication, I learned that no new extraction would be possible for at least 24 hours due to increased Mujahideen anti-aircraft activity in the area. I needed to survive, evade capture, and make it to the secondary extraction point, a river valley 15 kilometers northeast. Under normal circumstances, the journey would take 6 hours. With hostile forces actively hunting me, it might take days. The mountains of Afghanistan can be a sniper's greatest ally or deadliest enemy. The same terrain that offers perfect firing positions also limits movement and channelizes escape routes. I had to use every technique I'd learned in the harsh Spetsnaz training to survive. I traveled only at night, moving from shadow to shadow. During daylight, I found cover and observed, watching for patrols, memorizing their patterns, noting the locations of villages and shepherds. Everyone was a potential threat. The farmers in the fields, the shepherd boys with their flocks, all had been known to report Soviet movements to the Mujahideen. By the second day without extraction, paranoia had become my constant companion. Every snapped twig was an approaching enemy. Every distant voice carried on the wind was a hunter calling out my position. Sleep came in 15-minute intervals, my body trained to wake at the slightest sound. On the 3rd day, I encountered a patrol, too large to engage, too close to avoid. I found a crevice in the rocks and pressed myself into it, applying mud to my face and hands to reduce shine. 7 fighters moved through the valley below me, following the trail I had carefully avoided leaving. 1 fighter stopped, looking in my direction. Had he seen me? A bead of sweat ran down my temple as I placed my finger on the trigger. If I fired, I would eliminate the immediate threat, but reveal my position to the others. If I didn't fire, and he had spotted me. The fighter raised, his hand pointing directly at my position. My pulse pounded in my ears. In that moment, time seemed to slow. I exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The fighter dropped. Before the others could react, I had already fired twice more, dropping 2 additional fighters. The remaining 4 scattered for cover, returning fire blindly toward the ridge. I immediately repositioned, moving laterally along the ridge before they could pinpoint my location. The hunters had become the hunted. Over the next 20 minutes, I eliminated 2 more fighters as they attempted to flank my original position. The last 2 retreated, running back down the valley. They would return with reinforcements. I needed to move immediately. By nightfall, I reached the secondary extraction point, exhausted and dehydrated. My uniform was torn, my body covered in cuts and bruises from the hasty movement through treacherous terrain. I established the emergency signal pattern with my infrared strobe, visible only to Soviet aircraft equipped with proper detection equipment. 2 hours later, I heard the distinctive sound of Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunships approaching. 2 of them, flying low to avoid detection by shoulder-launched missiles. They touched down just long enough for me to board before immediately taking off again, hugging the terrain as they maneuvered through the valleys. Back at base in Kabul, I delivered the camera with its precious intelligence. The photographs clearly showed American CIA operatives meeting with Massoud's commanders, confirming direct U.S. involvement beyond the Pakistani intermediaries we had previously documented. Sergeant Anton Baranov received the Order of the Red Star posthumously. His body was never recovered. I returned to the field 2 weeks later with a new spotter. The war continued, but something had changed inside me. The mountains of Afghanistan had transformed me from a soldier into a ghost, haunting ridgelines and valleys, feared but never seen, dealing death from distances that seemed impossible. In the Hindu Kush, paranoia isn't a disorder, it's a survival mechanism. Fear isn't weakness, it's awareness. Behind enemy lines, those who lost these emotions died quickly. Those who mastered them became legends that Mujahideen fighters whispered about around their fires at night. I became one of those legends. But legends pay a price. Even now, years after returning home, I still sleep in 15-minute intervals. I still check lines of sight when entering a room. And I still hear Anton's last words, urging me to complete the mission, to bring back the proof, to show them what we had found. In war, the dead give orders that the living must obey. Starshina Mikhail Voronin, 27. 22nd Spetsnaz Brigade, GRU, born in USSR. The darkness was so complete it felt like drowning in ink. I pressed my back against the cold rock, feeling the sweat freeze against my skin despite the exertion of the climb. 6 hours we'd been moving through these godforsaken mountains, and now we were pinned down. The American-supplied thermal optics had changed everything. They shouldn't have seen us. They shouldn't have known. Contact front, 200 meters, Leonid hissed through clenched teeth. The first RPG screamed over our heads, impacting the mountainside behind us in a shower of rock and shrapnel. The muzzle flashes bloomed in the valley below. I counted at least 12 positions. We were outnumbered at least 4-1. They've got us bracketed, Stepan whispered, his voice steady but eyes wide with the knowledge we all shared. We were compromised, deep in enemy territory, with no extraction plan for another 18 hours. Colonel Baranov's words from the briefing echoed in my head. You do not exist. If captured, you were never there. The night erupted in automatic fire as I grabbed my radio. Our only hope now was to make it to the emergency extraction point. If we could make it through the night, if the Mujahideen didn't have us surrounded already, if. The mission was supposed to be straightforward, a 4-day infiltration operation 40 kilometers inside the Pakistani border to identify and eliminate a major weapons distribution hub feeding American and Chinese arms to the Mujahideen. Intelligence suggested this particular site was responsible for supplying the insurgents who had shot down 3 Mi-24 helicopters in the past month alone. Our 8-man team had been operating together for almost 2 years. We were the ghosts, the phantoms that the Mujahideen told stories about around their fires. The ones who came in the night and disappeared without a trace. At least that's what they told us at headquarters in Kabul. The insertion went perfectly. At 230, We were dropped by an Mi-8 helicopter in a remote valley 15 kilometers from the Pakistan border. The pilot had kept the bird low, hugging the terrain, using the mountain ridges to mask their approach from Pakistani radar. The crew chief gave us a thumbs up as we roped down into the darkness below. 6 days, Starshina. Not a minute more, he shouted over the rotor wash. The helicopter disappeared into the night, and the suffocating silence of the mountains descended upon us. I checked my VS-11 encrypted radio and signaled the team to move out. We had a 30-kilometer trek ahead of us through some of the most hostile territory on Earth. The Hindu Kush mountains were ancient and unforgiving, jagged peaks reaching over 7,000 meters stabbed at the sky, while narrow passes and valleys created perfect ambush points. It was terrain that favored the defender, the local, not the invader. The Afghans knew every goat path, every cave, every water source. We had maps, compasses, and training. It wasn't enough, and everyone knew it. By the second day, we'd crossed into Pakistan undetected. Moving only at night, we navigated by starlight and memorized terrain features. The border itself was meaningless, a line drawn on maps by men who had never set foot in these mountains. The reality was contested territory, tribal lands where loyalties shifted with the wind. Dmitri, our senior scout, spotted the first signs of the weapons compound by 400 on the third day. The facility was nestled in a narrow valley, with naturally defensive positions on 3 sides. It was larger than intelligence had indicated, at least 6 main structures with a perimeter of armed guards. We observed the compound through the remainder of the night and the following day from a concealed position 800 meters up the mountainside. I count at least 30 personnel, Stepan reported. Regular rotations of guards, but they're disciplined, not just local fighters, possibly Pakistani ISI. This complicated things. ISI involvement meant potential direct confrontation with Pakistani forces, something our commanders officially denied ever happened. It also meant better equipment, better training, and most concerning, better intelligence. I don't like it, Leonid muttered. Feels like we're being watched. I had learned to trust Leonid's instincts. The man had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan when the average Spetsnaz operator barely made it through one. We'll proceed with the mission, I decided after a moment's consideration. But we modify the plan. We go in lighter, faster. Plant the charges at the main storage areas only, then extract immediately. As dusk settled over the mountains, we moved into position. The darkness was our ally, our sanctuary. We applied. The black face paint in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. I found my hands trembling slightly as I checked my AKS-74 for the 3rd time. Was it the altitude, the cold, or something else? Remember, maintain radio silence unless absolutely necessary, I reminded the team. We meet at the extraction point at 200, no exceptions. We split into 3 groups. Leonid and Stepan would target the main weapons warehouse. Anton and Dmitri would eliminate the communications center. Grigory, Yuri, and Boris would provide overwatch and security from the ridgeline. I would place charges at the vehicle depot, where we had observed trucks being loaded with crates of weapons. Moving down the mountainside in absolute silence, I felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down. Every sense heightened, every movement calculated. The compound grew larger as we approached, the muted conversations of the guards becoming audible. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and I froze, counting the seconds until it fell, silent again. I passed the first perimeter guard without incident. He was young, barely more than a boy, and more interested in staying warm than maintaining vigilance. The Americans and their Saudi friends had done well recruiting the youth, with promises of paradise and payment to their families. This one would never collect. The silenced PB pistol made a dull thud as I ended his watch permanently and dragged his body into the shadows. One down, but how many more before the alarm was raised? I reached the vehicle depot at 2,330, exactly as planned. 5 trucks were parked in a loose semicircle, their cargo areas covered with canvas. I slipped beneath the first vehicle, attaching the explosive charge to the fuel tank. The Soviet-made plastic explosive was reliable, if not as sophisticated as what the Americans were providing to our enemies. My radio crackled softly. Falcon 2, possible compromise at position 3. Multiple hostiles moving toward your position. It was Boris from the Overwatch team. I froze, pressing myself against the wheel of the truck. Had we been detected already? I had placed charges on only 2 of the 5 vehicles. Understood. Continuing mission, I whispered into the radio. I moved faster now, less concerned with silence than with completion. The 3rd charge was placed in under a minute, the 4th in half that time. As I approached the final truck, I heard voices approaching, multiple speakers conversing in Pashto. I slid under the last truck just as flashlight beams swept the area. Boots crunched on the gravel just inches from my face. I held my breath, finger tensed on the trigger of my assault rifle. "Clear here," a voice called out in accented Russian. Russian? Why would the guards be speaking Russian? Unless, the realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just ISI or local mujahideen. There were Soviet advisors here, traitors working with the Americans and Pakistanis to funnel weapons to kill their own countrymen. The boots moved away, and I exhaled slowly. The final charge was placed with trembling hands. I set the timer for 45 minutes. Enough. Time for us to clear the immediate area but still coordinate with the other teams. My radio crackled again. Falcon 1 and Falcon 3 mission complete. Returning to rally point. The searchlight caught me completely by surprise. One moment I was in darkness, the next bathed in blinding white light. I rolled behind the truck as the first shots rang out, bullets sparking off the gravel where I had been standing seconds before. Intruder at the vehicle depot. All units respond. Alarms blared across the compound. So much for stealth. I fired a burst from my AKS-74, forcing the searchlight operator to duck. Using the momentary darkness, I sprinted for the perimeter fence. The night erupted in gunfire. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the compound as I ran in a zigzag pattern toward the extraction point. I could hear shouting behind me, engines starting. They were mobilizing to pursue. All units, compromise complete. Execute contingency Plan Zulu. Plan Zulu meant immediate detonation of all charges and emergency extraction. It also meant accepting casualties. We would not wait for everyone. To reach the rally point, I had just cleared the perimeter when the first explosions tore through the compound. The weapons warehouse went first, a massive fireball that momentarily turned night to day. The ammunition inside cooked off, sending rockets and bullets flying in all directions. The communication center was next, then the vehicle depot. The charges I had placed detonating in rapid succession. The shockwave knocked me off my feet, sending me tumbling down the rocky slope. My ears rang with the concussion as I struggled to regain my footing. Disoriented, I checked my compass and began moving toward the extraction point, 2 kilometers to the north. I had covered perhaps half that distance when I heard movement. Ahead. Dropping to a prone position, I peered through my night vision device. 3 figures were moving up the slope toward me, the wrong direction for my team. Falcon Actual, possible hostile contact, 500 meters south of Rally. Point, I whispered into my radio. Identified. We have you on thermal. 10 hostiles moving up your valley from the south. More converging from the east, Stepan's voice replied. That explained why they were moving with such confidence. They had thermal optics. Technology that could see through the darkness that had been our protection for so long. Rally point is compromised. Shift to alternate extraction point in Sector 4, I ordered. The alternate extraction point was over 8 kilometers away through difficult terrain. If the Mujahideen had vehicles, they could potentially cut us off by using the valley roads. I reunited with Stepan and Leonid at a small outcropping of rocks halfway up the mountainside. Their faces were grim in the faint starlight. Anton? Dmitri? I asked. Leonid shook his head slightly. No contact since the explosions. I nodded, pushing down the emotion. There would be time for that later, if we survived. Another RPG slammed into the rocks above us, showering us with debris. Leonid returned fire with the PKM, the heavy machine gun roaring in the confined space. We need to move, they're flanking us from the east. Stepan shouted over the gunfire. I grabbed a smoke grenade from my vest and pulled the pin. On my mark, we move up the ridgeline. There's a ravine 200 meters north that will give us cover to the extraction point. The smoke billowed. Out, a thick white cloud that would obscure us from visual observation but do nothing against thermal imaging. It was a desperate move, but we had few options left. Now! I yelled, and we broke cover, running in a crouched sprint up the steep slope. For the next 2 hours, we moved through the mountains like hunted animals. Every shadow concealed a potential enemy. Every sound signaled possible discovery. The paranoia was no longer just a feeling. It was our reality. We were alone, deep in hostile territory, with enemies all around us. Dawn was approaching as we finally reached the alternate extraction point, a small plateau with enough space for a helicopter to land. Yuri and Grigori were already there, setting up a perimeter. Of Boris, Anton, and Dmitri, there was no sign. Radio headquarters, I ordered. Request immediate extraction. Stepan worked the VS-11 radio, speaking in coded phrases that would alert Kabul to our situation without revealing our position to anyone listening. The first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern peaks. When we heard it, the distant thump of helicopter rotors echoing through the valleys. Never had a sound been so welcome, but the Mujahideen heard it too. The attack came suddenly, dozens of fighters emerging from concealed positions much closer than we had anticipated. They had been waiting, patiently, for this exact moment. "Contact all sides," Grigori shouted, his AK barking in rapid bursts. Leonid's PKM opened up, cutting down the first wave of attackers as they charged up the slope. I fired methodically, choosing targets, conserving ammunition. We needed to create a perimeter the helicopter could land within. The Mi-8 appeared over the ridgeline, a massive silhouette against the brightening sky. The door gunner opened up with the PKT machine gun, providing supporting fire as the pilot brought the helicopter into a hover 5 meters off the ground. "Go!" I shouted, as Yuri and Grigori broke for the helicopter. Leonid continued firing, emptying his last belt of ammunition into the advancing fighters. Stepan and I provided covering fire as he finally abandoned the PKM and ran for the helicopter. I was the last to board, leaping into the cabin as the helicopter was already rising. Bullets pinged off the fuselage as the pilot banked hard, putting the bulk of the mountain between us and the fighters below. Inside the helicopter, the reality of our mission sank in. Of 8 men, only 5 had returned. The others would be listed as missing in action in some classified report that few would ever read. Their families would receive the standard letter citing training accident as the cause. As we flew back toward the Soviet lines, I stared out at the endless mountains below. Somewhere down there, American weapons were still flowing to kill more Soviet soldiers. Somewhere down there, our own countrymen were helping the enemy. The paranoia didn't end when we crossed back into Afghanistan. In some ways, it only grew stronger. Who had compromised our mission? How had they known we were coming? In the mountains of Afghanistan, we learned that the enemies we could see were often less dangerous than those we couldn't. The ghost-like fighters were real enough, but the true phantoms were the doubts that followed us home, the suspicion that burrowed into our minds like shrapnel too deep to remove. This was the true legacy of fighting a shadow war, becoming shadows ourselves. Sergeant Mikhail Volkov, 28, 15th GRU Spetsnaz Brigade, born in Smolensk, Russia. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth as I bit down on my lip, suppressing the natural urge to breathe. My lungs burned for air, but movement meant death. The Mujahideen patrol was less than 30 meters away, 5 bearded fighters moving cautiously along the goat path that wound through the valley. Through my PSO-1 scope, I could see the sweat on their faces, the dust in their beards, even the American-made ammunition belts draped across their chests. My spotter Dmitri lay motionless beside me, his breathing so shallow I couldn't even sense it. We had been in position for 19 hours, buried under a layer of rocks and dirt on this miserable Afghan hillside. One of the fighters stopped suddenly, turning his head toward our position. My finger hovered over the trigger of my Dragunov. SVD, the weight of the decision crushing down on me heavier than the rocks that concealed us. If I took the shot now, we would never make it back to base alive. If I didn't, they might discover us anyway. In moments like these, Seconds stretch into eternities. 3 weeks earlier, I had been sitting in the officers' mess at our forward operating base in Jalalabad, drinking tea that tasted like dirt and listening to the radio operator announce, "Incoming helicopters." I had been in Afghanistan for 14 months already, with 2 months remaining in my tour. The Mujahideen had been growing bolder, supplied with increasingly sophisticated weapons from the Americans via Pakistan. What had started as an international duty to help our Afghan comrades had descended into a bloody stalemate with no victory in sight. "Volkov, report to Colonel Yashin immediately," the duty officer called out. Colonel Yashin was the commander of our Special Operations Detachment, a veteran of countless operations who carried the permanent smell of strong tobacco and spoke in a voice ravaged by years of shouting orders over gunfire. His office was a Spartan affair, a metal desk, 3 chairs, and maps of the surrounding provinces pinned to the walls. "Sergeant Volkov reporting as ordered, Comrade Colonel," I said, standing at attention. "At ease, Volkov." He didn't look, up from the map spread before him. "We have intelligence on a high-value target moving through the Kunar province. Ahmad Zadran, one of Masood's lieutenants. He's coordinating a major weapons shipment coming in from Pakistan." Now he looked up, his gray eyes as cold as a Siberian winter. "You and Sergeant Barsukov will eliminate him." I studied the map. The target zone was deep in Mujahideen territory, a treacherous landscape of steep valleys and hidden cave networks. The nearest Soviet presence was an isolated outpost 30 kilometers away. "We'll need to insert at night," I said. "And we'll need at least 5 days of supplies. You have 3 days to complete the mission," Yashin replied flatly. "The Mi-8 will drop you tomorrow at 0200 hours. After that, you're on your own until extraction." Dmitry Barsukov was waiting outside. At 24, he was younger than me, but had already earned a reputation as one of the best spotters in the brigade. His eyes could pick out a camouflaged fighter at 800 meters, and he could calculate wind speed just by watching the movement of vegetation. "Well," he asked. "We're hunting a commander," I told him. "Deep insertion, minimal support." Dmitry nodded, his face betraying no emotion. "The usual, then." We spent the rest of the day preparing our equipment. The Dragunov SVD was already cleaned and zeroed from the previous mission. I packed 7 10-round magazines, knowing that in real terms, each bullet needed to count. Ammunition was precious, and resupply impossible. Our ghillie suits were customized for the rocky terrain of eastern Afghanistan, a patchwork of browns, grays, and dusty yellows, rather than the greens used in more forested environments. At 0145 hours, we were at the helipad. Our faces blackened, equipment checked and double-checked. The Mi-8 appeared as a dark shape against the night sky, its rotors slicing through the air with a rhythmic thump that had become the soundtrack of this war. No words were exchanged as we boarded. The 2 pilots and the door gunner knew the drill. This was a black operation, officially non-existent. The flight lasted 45 minutes, the helicopter hugging the terrain to avoid radar detection. When the crew chief signaled 5 minutes to drop, Dmitry and I performed our final equipment check. The helicopter never fully landed. We rappelled down into darkness as it hovered momentarily, then vanished back into the night sky. The silence that followed was absolute. We were now 70 kilometers from the nearest Soviet forces in territory completely controlled by the Mujahideen. Discovery meant certain death, either in combat or by the prolonged torture the rebels reserved for captured Spetsnaz. "Comms check," I whispered into the radio. "Signal clear," came the reply from base, though both of us knew that once we moved deeper into the mountains, communication would become intermittent at best. We moved only at night for the first 2 days, covering 15 kilometers of brutal terrain. During daylight hours, we hid in rocky outcroppings or shallow caves, taking turns sleeping in 2-hour shifts. The heat was punishing, often reaching 40 degrees Celsius, with no shade except what we could create with our camouflage tarps. Our intelligence indicated that Zadran would be meeting with local commanders in a small village nested in a narrow valley. The optimal firing position was a ridge overlooking the village from the east, offering clear lines of sight to the largest structure where meetings would likely take place. Reaching the ridge required traversing an exposed section, of terrain used by local goat herds and mujahideen patrols. We waited until 0200 hours on our third night before attempting the crossing. The moonlight was minimal, but still enough to get us killed if we were spotted. It took us 3 hours to cover 600 meters, moving inches at a time whenever the sentry posted at the village entrance looked away. "We need to be in position before dawn," Dmitri whispered, as we finally reached the base of the ridge. "The meeting is scheduled for 1000 hours. The climb was treacherous, loose shale threatening to cascade down with each step. My hands were bloody from gripping sharp rocks, but we reached our chosen position with an hour of darkness to spare. The spot offered a clear view of the village center and the main building, approximately 600 meters away, a challenging but makeable shot with the Dragunov. "Let's dig in," I said, and we began the painstaking process of creating our hide. Constructing a proper sniper hide is as much art as science. We scraped out a shallow depression, just deep enough for both of us to lie prone with the rifle supported. The excavated soil was carefully distributed so as not to create suspicious mounds. We then covered ourselves with the ghillie suits and added local vegetation and rocks for additional concealment. By the time the first light broke over the Hindu Kush, we were invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for us. Now began the hardest part of any sniper operation, the wait. Hours stretched into an eternity as the village below came to life. Women emerged to collect water. Children played in the dusty streets. Men gathered in small groups to smoke and talk. Through my scope, these distant figures became intimate. Acquaintances, though they had no idea they were being watched. "Movement at the north entrance," Dmitri murmured at 0930 hours. 3 vehicles. Technical lead with DSHK. The vehicles were Toyota pickups, the lead one mounted with a heavy machine gun. As they entered the village, a group of men emerged from the main building. Even from this distance, I could identify Zadran by his distinctive red turban and tall frame. "Target confirmed," I whispered. "Range? 620 meters," Dmitri replied after a quick calculation with his rangefinder. "Wind from the west, approximately 8 kilometers per hour. Temperature adjustment of +2. I made the necessary adjustments to my scope, my mind already calculating the bullet drop and drift. The 7.62 by 54 millimeter R round from the Dragunov would drop approximately 120 centimeters over this distance. I needed to aim significantly above my target. "Breathe," Dmitri reminded me. I inhaled slowly, then exhaled halfway, holding the remainder. My heartbeat slowed as I entered that perfect space between beats where the body is momentarily still. The crosshairs settled just above Zadran's chest as he stood talking to a local commander. The crack of the Dragunov shattered the morning calm. Through the scope, I watched Zadran collapse, a spray of crimson erupting from his chest. The round had struck true. Chaos erupted instantly. Women screamed, children ran for cover, and fighters poured out of buildings with weapons raised. The disciplined ones immediately took cover. The others fired wildly in all directions, having no idea where the shot had come from. "Confirm kill," Dmitri said calmly. "Target down," I replied, already preparing to move. No movement. In our briefing, we had been told that once the shot was taken, we had to immediately exfiltrate to our extraction point 30 kilometers away. The Mujahideen would quickly organize search parties, and the narrow valleys offered limited escape routes. We slithered backward from our position, leaving the hide intact to confuse pursuers. Only when we were 50 meters down the backside of the ridge did we rise to a crouch and begin moving more quickly. "They'll check the high ground first," Dmitri said as we picked our way through a dry stream bed. "We need to put at least 5 kilometers between us and the village before they organize properly." We moved rapidly for the next 3 hours, using ravines and dry watercourses for cover. The landscape provided natural concealment, but also channeled our movement in predictable ways, something the experienced Mujahideen fighters would know. At approximately 1400 hours, we heard the distant sound of vehicles moving in the valley below us. Through binoculars, we could see 3 pickup trucks filled with fighters moving along the main road that paralleled our route. "They're cutting us off," Dmitri said. "They know we're heading for Soviet lines." We diverted to a higher route, climbing steep goat paths that wound through the mountains. The physical toll was enormous, each of us carrying nearly 30 kilograms of equipment under the merciless Afghan sun. By nightfall, we had covered only 12 kilometers, less than half the distance to our extraction point. "We need to find shelter for the night," I said, my throat parched despite careful rationing of our water. "There," Dmitri pointed to a cluster of rocks that formed a natural alcove on the mountainside. "We can defend it if necessary." As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted, another cruel aspect of Afghan geography. We huddled in our shelter, eating cold rations and taking turns on watch. Neither of us slept more than minutes at a time, the constant threat keeping us in a state of hyper-awareness. Dawn brought no relief. As we prepared to move out, Dmitri spotted dust clouds in the valley below, more search parties converging on our position. "They must have informants watching for our extraction helicopter," he said grimly. We altered our route again, heading into even more difficult terrain. Progress slowed to a crawl as we navigated near vertical slopes and narrow ledges. By midday, we could hear sporadic gunfire echoing through the valleys, search parties firing into potential hiding spots. Our water was dangerously low, and the extraction point was still 18 kilometers away. The radio remained silent despite repeated attempts to contact base. Either the mountains were blocking transmission, or command had decided we were already dead. As we descended into a narrow valley to cross to the next ridgeline, disaster struck. A Mujahideen patrol appeared suddenly on the path ahead of us, 5 fighters moving cautiously along the goat trail. We froze instantly, dropping to the ground behind a small outcropping of rocks. They hadn't seen us yet, but they were heading directly toward our position. With nowhere to retreat, we quickly scraped away at the rocky soil, creating shallow depressions and covering ourselves with the ghillie suits. Within minutes, we were concealed beneath a layer of dirt and rocks, our breathing reduced to the shallowest possible intake of air. The patrol approached slowly, stopping frequently to survey the surrounding terrain. The lead fighter, carrying an AK-47 with an underfolding stock, passed within 5 meters of our position. I could smell the distinctive odor of Naswar, the tobacco mixture many Afghans kept tucked in their lower lips. One fighter stopped suddenly, turning his head toward our position. My finger tensed on the trigger of my Dragunov. If he discovered us, I would have one chance to fire before they overwhelmed us. He stared in our direction for what seemed an eternity, then called something to his comrades in Pashto. My limited understanding caught the words for rocks and nothing. After a tense moment, they continued down the path, eventually disappearing around a bend in the valley. We remained motionless for another 30 minutes, ensuring they were truly gone. When we finally rose, our muscles screamed in protest after maintaining such unnatural stillness. "We need to move fast," Dmitri said. "They'll circle back through this valley." We pushed ourselves beyond exhaustion that day, covering the remaining distance to the extraction point in a grueling 14-hour march. When we finally reached the designated location, a relatively flat section of plateau suitable for helicopter landing, it was 0200 hours, a full day after our scheduled extraction. The radio crackled to life as we reached higher ground. "Falcon 3, this is Nest. Do you copy?" "Nest, this is Falcon 3, I responded, relief flooding through me. "Request immediate extraction." "Understood, Falcon 3. Extraction in 30 minutes. Mark LZ with infrared." When the Mi-8 appeared on the horizon, its silhouette barely visible against the night sky, I felt nothing. Not relief, not triumph, not even the satisfaction of completing our mission. Just emptiness. Another commander dead, another tally mark, another mission that would change nothing in this endless, pointless war. As we lifted off, I looked down at the mountains fading into darkness below. Somewhere down there, Ahmad Zadran's body was already being prepared for burial, and another commander was already taking his place. The Americans would send more weapons through Pakistan, and we would send more young men like Dmitri and me to die in these mountains. The colonel would declare our mission a success. Perhaps there would even be medals. But sitting in the vibrating hull of the helicopter, I knew the truth that all of us who fought in these mountains eventually learned. There were no victories in Afghanistan, only moments of survival purchased at an ever-increasing cost. Major Mikhail Romanov, 32, Group A, Alpha Group, KGB Special Forces. Born in Leningrad, Russian SFSR. The ZIL-131 truck bounced violently as we approached the final checkpoint, its headlights cutting through Kabul's winter darkness. Behind our vehicle, 5 more trucks carried the remainder of our assault force, 30-odd operators from KGB Group A and GRU Zenit teams dressed in Afghan Army uniforms. My gloved hand tightened around the modified AKMS tucked against my chest. Its folding stock collapsed. Checkpoint 200 meters, Captain Boyarinov muttered from the driver's seat. I nodded, scrutinizing the Afghan soldiers through night vision goggles. They appeared relaxed, unsuspecting. Beyond them loomed our objective, Tajbeg Palace, an imposing fortress perched atop a hill overlooking Kabul. Inside was our target, Hafizullah Amin, the Afghan leader whose increasingly erratic behavior had become a liability to Moscow. Communications check, I whispered into my throat mic. The radio crackled with confirmation from both assault teams and our supports from the 154th Separate Spetsnaz Detachment. In precisely 7 minutes, the operation would commence. The success or failure of the entire Soviet intervention in Afghanistan hinged on the next 60 minutes. Remember, I told the men crowded around me in the truck's cargo compartment. Speed, violence of action, and precision fire. No hesitation. The palace guards waved us through the checkpoint. They had no idea that Operation Storm 333 was about to begin. 72 hours earlier, I had been conducting winter survival training with my Alpha team, near Moscow when the secure telephone rang. 20 minutes later, I was boarding a military transport aircraft with sealed orders. Only once airborne did I break the seal. Comrade Major, General Drozdov had written, "You are being deployed to Kabul, Afghanistan, to lead a special operation of strategic importance to state security. Details upon arrival." The details, as they emerged during our briefing at the Soviet embassy in Kabul, were stark. President Amin had become dangerously unpredictable, executing purges within his own party and government. Intelligence suggested he might be opening back-channel communications with the Americans. The Politburo had made its decision. Amin would be removed, and Babrak Karmal installed as the new leader of Afghanistan. Our mission, designated Storm 333, was the tip of a much larger spear. While we neutralized Amin and secured key government installations in Kabul, the 40th Army would cross the Amu Darya River, beginning a major military intervention. The operation's timing was precise. 19:30 hours on December 27, 1979. Colonel Boyarinov spread the operational maps across the table in our secure planning room. Tajbeg Palace sits here. He indicated a hilltop structure southwest of Kabul. Constructed in the 1920s for the royal family, 3 stories, reinforced concrete construction, multiple entrance points. The colonel traced his finger in a circle around the palace. Approximately 500 members of the Afghan Presidential Brigade guard the complex. Our intelligence indicates the heaviest concentrations are positioned here, here, and here. He marked 3 points along the perimeter. The palace communications center is located on the 1st floor, eastern wing, he continued. Amin's personal quarters are on the 3rd floor, western wing. Both are priority targets. I studied the palace schematics, committing them to memory. Guard relief schedules? Changes at 1,800 and 600 hours. Will execute during the night shift when alertness typically diminishes. Afghan Army response capabilities? The 26th Airborne Regiment is stationed 15 kilometers northeast. Response time estimated at 25 to 30 minutes once alerted. And our insertion? Colonel Boyarinov's expression remained impassive. Primary assault force will approach via ground transportation, posing as Afghan military units. Simultaneously, Our Muslim battalion troops will create a diversion at these 3 points. He indicated positions around the palace perimeter. Supporting elements? The 345th Independent Guards Airborne Regiment will secure the military airfield and radio station. The 154th Spetsnaz will neutralize the Ministry of Interior and the Central Committee building. I nodded, calculating angles of approach, fields of fire, and potential fallback positions. Communications, secure radio frequency with authentication protocols. Codeword Baran indicates mission success. Mitel indicates mission failure. For the next 36 hours, we rehearsed the assault sequence, first on scale models, then in a similar building on the outskirts of Kabul. We memorized the palace layout, studied guard positions, and practiced breaching techniques. Each man understood his specific responsibilities. By the evening of December 27, our preparations were complete. We donned Afghan army uniforms and applied dark face paint. Standard issue AKMSs were equipped with PBS-1 silencers. Each operator carried 4 magazines of 7 62x39mm ammunition, 2 RGD-5 fragmentation grenades, 1 RGO defensive grenade, and 1 signal flare. Select personnel carried specialized equipment, breaching charges, RPG-7s with PG-7VL tandem warhead rounds capable of penetrating reinforced concrete, and PK machine guns for suppressive fire. At 18:30 hours, we loaded into the ZIL-1, 131 trucks and departed the embassy compound. The winter air bit through my uniform as I finalized the timing with Captain Boyarinov. Outside temperature, -7 Celsius. Wind, minimal, from the northeast at approximately 35 kph. Visibility, excellent, with a 3/4 moon providing natural illumination. Conditions optimal for night operations. 5 minutes to execution, Boyarinov confirmed, checking his chronometer. I nodded, surveying the palace through my night vision. The guard rotations proceeded as expected, predictable, methodical, precisely what we needed. At 19:25, a series of explosions erupted from the opposite side of the palace compound, our Muslim battalion creating the planned diversion. Guards rushed toward the disturbance, thinning the defenses. Near our approach vector. Go, I ordered. Our 6-vehicle convoy accelerated toward the palace, approaching from the northeastern access road. As we neared the main vehicle gate, the lead truck stopped abruptly. 4 operators disguised as Afghan officers approached the gate guards, engaging them in conversation. Suddenly, suppressed weapons fire crackled from the lead vehicle. The gate guards collapsed silently. Gate secured, came the report through my headset. Proceeding to Phase 2, our vehicles raced through the opening, dispersing to predetermined positions around the palace. My team, designated Thunder, would breach the eastern entrance and neutralize the communications center. Boyarinov's team, Storm, would simultaneously assault the western wing to locate and secure Amin. As we dismounted, the distant thunder of rotors announced the arrival of Mi-8 helicopters carrying our support elements. Palace defenses were already responding to the diversion, anti-aircraft guns opening fire on the helicopters. Tracer rounds arced through the night sky as the Mi-8s took evasive action. First squad, communications center, I ordered. Second squad, secure the eastern stairwell. Third squad, establish perimeter defense. Execute. We moved swiftly through the palace grounds, utilizing pre-planned routes to minimize exposure. The external guards, already responding to the diversion, failed to detect our infiltration until we reached the eastern entrance. 2 guards posted. At the doorway raised their weapons. Our point man eliminated both with precision fire from his silenced AKMS, 2 rounds each, center mass. We stepped over their bodies and breached the entrance. Inside, the palace was a labyrinth of ornate corridors and chambers. We navigated by memory from the rehearsals, moving in practice formation. 2 men covering forward, 1 watching our flanks, 1 securing our rear. The sound of intensifying gunfire echoed from the western wing, indicating Boyarinov's team had encountered resistance. We reached the communications center 3 minutes after entry. 4 Afghan operators manned the equipment, with 2 armed guards positioned by the door. They reacted with surprise as we burst into the room. "Weapons down," I ordered in Dari, using one of the few phrases I had memorized. When they hesitated, we opened fire. 6 seconds later, all 6 were neutralized. My communication specialist moved immediately to the equipment, placing pre-prepared demolition charges designed to disable without complete destruction. We needed the communications network intact for the next phase but temporarily offline during our operation. Communications center secured, I reported into my radio, proceeding to rendezvous point Alpha. The response came immediately, distorted by gunfire in the background. Storm team encountering heavy resistance near presidential quarters. Request immediate support. Thunder team redirecting, I confirmed, signaling my men to change course. Moving to Western Wing, we navigated through the palace's second floor, encountering sporadic resistance from palace guards. Most were disorganized, confused by the multiple points of attack and the Afghan uniforms we wore. This confusion was deliberate, a key element of our operational design. As we approached the Western Wing, the intensity of gunfire increased dramatically. Boyarinov's team had encountered Amin's personal bodyguards, elite troops armed with AK-74s and RPKs, fighting with unexpected discipline. We flanked the engagement, approaching from the northern corridor. Through an ornate doorway, I could see Boyarinov's men pinned down behind overturned furniture, exchanging fire with defenders entrenched behind a barricade of tables and cabinets. I signaled to my grenadier, who prepared an RGD-5 fragmentation grenade. After confirming Boyarinov's position, he pulled the pin, waited 2 seconds, and tossed the grenade over the barricade. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, momentarily disorienting everyone. We exploited the moment, surging forward, through the dust and debris. 3 defenders lay motionless behind the shattered barricade. 2 more raised their hands in surrender. "Status?" I asked Boyarinov as my team secured the prisoners. 3 wounded, 1 critical, he reported, gesturing to a fallen operator receiving medical attention. Amin is in the presidential suite, 1 level up. Heavy guard presence. I nodded, reformulating our approach. Combined assault. Your team establishes base of fire from the main staircase. My team will access through the service elevator shaft and execute pincer movement. Boyarinov nodded, directing his remaining operators into position. While they deployed, my team accessed the service corridor, locating the staff elevator used by palace personnel. The power had been cut during our initial breach, rendering the elevator inoperable, exactly as planned. 2 of my operators removed the elevator doors using specialized tools. I peered up the shaft, confirming it aligned with our intelligence. The presidential suite was accessible through a service entrance off this shaft, a vulnerability in the palace's defensive design. "Ascend," I ordered. "Prepare for immediate action upon reaching target level." We climbed the shaft using rope systems, maintaining tactical silence. Upon reaching the 3rd floor, we carefully opened the service doors, emerging into a small preparation room adjacent to the presidential dining area. Through a partially open door, I could see Afghan guards positioned around the main entrance, their attention focused on the staircase where Boyarinov's team would soon launch their diversion. I keyed my radio twice, the signal for Boyarinov to commence firing. Immediately, the staccato of automatic weapons erupted from the staircase. The guards rushed to respond, focusing their attention away from our position. "Execute," I ordered simply. We burst through the door into the presidential quarters, catching the defenders in perfect crossfire. 7 guards fell in the initial exchange. The remaining 3 attempted to establish defensive positions behind furniture. "Amin location?" I demanded from one wounded guard in rudimentary Dari. He gestured toward an ornate double door at the far end of the room. I directed 2 operators to secure the prisoners while the rest of us approached the indicated doors. No time for subtlety. I nodded to my breacher, who placed a small-shaped charge on the door hinges. We took cover as the focused explosion separated the doors from their frame. Inside, we found Hafizullah Amin in his pajamas, attempting to contact someone on a radio set. 2 bodyguards raised their weapons but hesitated upon seeing our Afghan uniforms, momentarily confused. That hesitation proved fatal. Once the room was secured, I approached Amin, who stared at us with a mixture of defiance and disbelief. "Who sent you?" he demanded in Russian, surprising me. The Americans? Your service to the revolution is concluded, Comrade President, I responded, also in Russian. Recognition dawned in his eyes. The Soviets? But we are allies. I didn't confirm or deny, instead, securing him with plastic restraints while my communication specialist reported success on our secure channel. Package secured. Initiating extraction. According to our original plan, Amin was to be taken alive for later public trial. However, history would record that he died during the assault, a detail I would only learn about afterward. In special operations, plans often change during execution. By 2015 hours, 45 minutes after our initial breach, the palace was secured. Our casualties included 5 dead and 11 wounded, including Colonel Boyarinov, who fell during the final phase of the operation. The Tajbeg Palace, once an impenetrable fortress, had been captured by a force a fraction of the size of its defenders. Outside, the Soviet 40th Army was already crossing the border. Mi-24 helicopters circled overhead, their distinctive silhouettes visible against the night sky. By morning, Kabul would be under complete Soviet control, and Babrak Karmal would be announced as Afghanistan's new leader. Operation Storm 333 was officially classified as a success, a textbook example of special operations. Tactics. The mission accomplished its immediate objectives with acceptable losses and precise execution. Within hours, key government buildings, media outlets, and military installations throughout Kabul were under Soviet control. What none of us could have anticipated that night was that we weren't ending a conflict. We were beginning one that would last for nearly a decade, cost thousands of Soviet lives, and ultimately contribute to the dissolution of the very country we served. Every war has a beginning. Sometimes it comes not with a declaration or a massive invasion, but with a single precisely executed operation in the darkness. For the Soviet-Afghan War, that beginning was Operation Storm 333. 23 minutes that changed history. Technical success. Strategic catastrophe. That is the paradox of special operations warfare, in which the tactical brilliance of a mission can be overshadowed by its long-term consequences. I have carried that knowledge with me ever since that cold December night in Kabul. Abdul Rahman Wardak, 34. Mujahideen fighter under Commander Jalaluddin Haqqani, born in Zurmat, Paktia province. The Russian Mi-8 helicopter appeared suddenly over the ridgeline, its rotors beating the thin mountain air like an angry metal bird. Below it, a column of BTR-70 armored personnel carriers crawled along the narrow valley road, their diesel engines growling as they navigated the sharp turns. I pressed myself deeper into the rocky outcropping, my weathered hands steady on the detonator wires as I watched the convoy through ancient Soviet binoculars. The helicopter passed directly overhead, no more than 200 meters above me, its crew scanning the valley walls for threats. They did not see me. They never saw us until it was too late. "Not yet, brothers," I whispered to the 5 fighters, hidden with me among the boulders, their fingers tight on their weapons, a mix of ancient British Lee Enfield rifles and newer AK-47s provided by our Pakistani allies. "Wait for the command vehicle." The morning sun glinted off the armored column as it entered the killing zone. 20 vehicles in total, 18 BTRs, 1 UAZ command jeep, and a single ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft gun on the end. The road ahead was clear, showing no signs of the 45 anti-tank mines we had buried during 3 cold nights of work. Buried not randomly, but in a careful pattern that would split the column at its weakest point. I felt a strange sense of calm as the command vehicle crossed the invisible line we had marked with a pile of 3 small stones. The invaders had brought their technological might to our mountains, helicopter gunships, artillery, night vision devices, but we had brought patience. And in Afghanistan, patience had outlasted empires for centuries. I squeezed the detonator, and the earth itself rose up against the Russians. The war had been raging for 4 years when I joined Haqqani's fighters in the summer of 1983. The Soviets had thought their invasion would be swift, a simple matter of replacing one government with another, securing the major cities, and controlling the countryside through their Afghan communist allies. But Afghanistan is not built for occupation. Our land itself resists invasion, as it has since the time of Alexander. I had been a teacher before the war, educated in Kabul with some additional training in Pakistan. I spoke Russian, a skill that proved valuable for interpreting, captured documents and radio transmissions. But when the Soviets bombed my village, killing 17, including my younger brother, I exchanged my books for weapons and joined the resistance. Commander Haqqani had established himself as one of the most effective Mujahideen leaders in eastern Afghanistan. Unlike some commanders who focused on defending their home territories, Haqqani aggressively targeted Soviet supply lines, particularly along the crucial highway between Gardez and Khost. His reputation for tactical skill had attracted support from both Pakistan's ISI intelligence service and, increasingly, from the Americans, who provided funding and weapons through Pakistani intermediaries. It was the Americans who had recently supplied us with the Italian-made TC-6 anti-tank mines that we would use in the operation I was now planning. The mines were more sophisticated than our usual Soviet-captured devices, with better triggers and lower metal content that made them harder for Russian mine detectors to locate. "These will stop their armored vehicles," said Daoud, our Pakistani advisor, as he demonstrated how to arm the mines. "But you must place them in the correct pattern to be effective. One mine may disable a vehicle. Many mines, correctly placed, will destroy a convoy." We trained for 2 weeks in the technical aspects of mine warfare: how to camouflage the devices, how to create secondary triggering mechanisms, how to channel enemy vehicles into killing zones. Much of this was familiar to us already through bitter experience, but the new mines required new techniques. Our target was a major supply convoy that intelligence indicated would move from the Soviet base at Gardez to their forward positions near Khost in mid-October. The convoy would reportedly carry ammunition, fuel, and winter supplies essential for the continued operation of the forward bases. If we could destroy it, several Soviet outposts would be left vulnerable as winter approached. On October 10, I led a team of 12 fighters into position along the Gardez Coast Highway. We split into 3 groups. My team of 6 would handle the primary ambush with mines, while 2 teams of 3 fighters each would take up positions with RPG-7s on the valley slopes to target any vehicles that survived the initial explosions. Remember, I told them the night before, the Russians will respond with helicopter gunships within 15 minutes of the attack. We must complete our mission and be moving toward the extraction point before they arrive. We planted the mines during 3 consecutive nights, working in the darkest hours when Soviet night patrols were least active. The work was painfully slow and dangerous. Each mine had to be carefully placed, armed, and then completely concealed. A single mistake, a mine improperly armed or insufficiently hidden, could doom the entire operation and our lives. During daylight hours, we hid in caves and crevices in the valley walls, eating cold rations and praying. Most of my fighters were simple men, farmers and herdsmen who had taken up arms after suffering losses to Soviet bombing or Afghan communist persecution. Their understanding of the broader geopolitical struggle was limited, but their commitment to defending their homes and faith was absolute. Karim, the youngest at just 19, kept his father's prayer beads wrapped around his wrist as he worked. His father had been executed by communist authorities in Kabul for refusing to surrender his small shop to the state. "The Russians have tanks and planes," he said one night as we huddled around a tiny shielded fire for warmth. "But Allah sees everything. He is on our side." Mustafa, our oldest fighter at 47, grunted in response. "Allah helps those who fight wisely. The Russians are not the first to come to Afghanistan with their machines. The British had their rifles and cannons. Alexander had his phalanxes. All of them are gone. The mountains remain." I thought of this exchange as I watched the Soviet convoy approaching our position. The contrast was stark. Their armored vehicles and helicopters representing the height of modern military technology, while we fought with improvised explosives and decades-old rifles. Yet here we were, dictating the terms of engagement. These Command vehicle reached our trigger point, and I squeezed the detonator. The explosion was massive, far larger than I had anticipated. Several mines detonated simultaneously, creating a roiling ball of fire that engulfed the UAZ Jeep and the BTR behind it. The shockwave rattled stones around our position. Allahu Akbar! Shouted Karim involuntarily, as secondary explosions ripped through the vehicles. We had struck their fuel trucks. The convoy was now split exactly as we had planned. The lead vehicles, cut off from the rest, immediately began taking fire from our RPG teams on the slopes. I saw a rocket strike the turret of a BTR, sending it spinning violently off the road. The Russians reacted quickly, as they always did. Soldiers poured from the undamaged vehicles, establishing a perimeter and returning fire toward the RPG positions. The ZSU-23-4 at the rear of the convoy began sweeping the valley walls with its 4 23mm autocannons, filling the air with deadly fragments as its radar sought targets. The helicopter that had passed overhead wheeled around sharply, its door gunner already firing toward the RPG positions. I keyed our radio, a captured Soviet model. "Falcon teams, shift positions now," I ordered. Our RPG teams would fire a final volley, then move to secondary positions before the helicopter could fix their location. I turned to my demolition team. Second sequence. This time, Omar pressed his detonator. Another section of road, this one behind the rear elements of the convoy, erupted in dust and flame. The convoy was now completely trapped, unable to move forward or backward on the narrow road. Through my binoculars, I could see the Russian commander gesturing frantically, organizing his men into defensive positions. He was experienced, not panicking, but methodically establishing fields of fire. The helicopter began making low passes directly over the convoy, trying to suppress our fire and locate our positions. "They're calling for reinforcements," said Hamid, our radio operator, who was monitoring the Russian frequencies. 2 Mi-24 gunships launching from Gardez. 8 minutes. We had anticipated this. The Soviet bases maintained constant alert status with helicopter gunships ready to respond to ambushes. Once the Hinds arrived with their heavy weapons, our advantage would quickly evaporate. "Begin final phase," I ordered. This was the most dangerous part of our plan. While the RPG teams kept the Russians occupied from the slopes, 3 of my men and I would approach closer to the convoy, using a dry stream bed for cover. From there, we would employ our newest weapons, the American-supplied FM-92 Stinger missiles. The Stingers had only recently been introduced to our forces, and few fighters were trained in their use. I had received instruction from an American operator, a CIA agent who identified himself only as Mike, at a training camp across the Pakistani border 2 months earlier. "This will change the war," Mike had told us as he demonstrated the shoulder-fired missile system. "The Russians own the air now. Once you can shoot down their helicopters, they'll have to fight on your terms." We moved silently down the streambed, the sounds of combat providing cover for our approach. When we reached our firing position, roughly 800 meters from where the helicopter was making its passes, we carefully assembled the Stinger launcher. "Bismillah," I whispered, as I raised the weapon to my shoulder and acquired the Mi-8 in the sighting system. The helicopter was making another low pass, its door gunner firing at suspected positions on the slopes. The Stinger emitted its distinctive tone, indicating a lock on the helicopter's heat signature. I squeezed the trigger, feeling the weapon leap against my shoulder as the missile streaked toward its target. The Mi-8 pilot must have detected the launch, as the helicopter suddenly pitched upward in an evasive maneuver. But it was too late. The missile struck its engine compartment, creating a small explosion that quickly grew as the fuel ignited. The helicopter spun violently, black smoke pouring from its failing engines, before crashing into the valley floor, less than 100 meters from the trapped convoy. The psychological impact on the Russian forces was immediate and visible. Even from our distance, I could see soldiers diving for better cover, their heads swiveling to scan the skies as if expecting death from above. "We have 5 minutes before the Hinds arrive," I said, checking my watch. "Gather the equipment. We're leaving." As we retreated up the streambed toward our extraction route, I took a final look at the scene behind us. At least 8 Russian vehicles were burning, their ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. The survivors had formed a tight perimeter around the remaining vehicles, returning fire at our departing RPG teams. They were professionally trained soldiers fighting as they had been taught, but they were fighting the wrong war in the wrong place. We reached our rendezvous point, a goat herder's hut 3 kilometers from the ambush site, 20 minutes later. From there, we split into pairs, each taking different routes back to our base camp in the mountains near the Pakistani border. This was standard procedure. Smaller groups were harder to track and less likely to be spotted by helicopter patrols. Karim and I traveled together, moving through high mountain passes that only locals knew existed. As we climbed higher, the sounds of combat faded behind us. We could see smoke rising from the valley and hear the distinctive thump of the Mi-24 gunships that had arrived to support the beleaguered convoy. "Do you think the Americans will give us more stingers?" Karim asked as we paused to rest, in the shelter of an overhanging rock. "If we prove we can use them effectively, yes," I replied. "The Americans want the Russians to bleed in Afghanistan. We want the Russians gone from our land. For now, our interests align." Karim nodded thoughtfully. "But after the Russians leave, what will the Americans want then?" It was a perceptive question from the young fighter. "That," I said, "is a problem for another day. First, we must win this war." By nightfall, we had reached our forward base, a cluster of stone huts nestled in a hidden valley. Other fighters from the ambush had already arrived, bringing confirmation of our success. 18 Russians killed, 11 vehicles destroyed, 1 helicopter shot down. It was a significant victory, and word would spread quickly through the mountains, bringing more recruits to our cause. Commander Haqqani called me to his quarters that evening. Unlike some Mujahideen leaders who embraced a theatrical warrior image, Haqqani was austere and serious, a former religious scholar turned military commander by necessity rather than choice. "The operation was successful," he said, studying a map spread on the floor before him. "But the Russians will adapt. They always do. They'll start sending more helicopter escorts with their convoys," I agreed. "And they'll increase their mine-clearing operations." Haqqani nodded. "And we will find new ways to strike them. This is our way, adaptability. They have technology and firepower. We have patience and knowledge of the land." He traced a finger along the map, indicating the mountain ranges that had been Afghanistan's natural defense for centuries. "Every invader has the same weakness. They must move along the valleys and passes to project their power. And in those valleys and passes, we will bleed them until they leave or until we die." That night, as I performed my evening prayers, I reflected on the day's events. We had matched primitive tactics and improvised explosives against armored vehicles and helicopters, and we had won. Not through superior firepower, but through superior understanding of the terrain and a willingness to endure hardship that the Russians could not match. The war would continue for years, a slow, grinding conflict that would eventually sap the Soviet will to fight, just as it had broken the British a century earlier. Technology and modern weapons would play their role, but Afghanistan's true strength had always been its people and its unforgiving landscape, patient, enduring, and ultimately unconquerable. As Mustafa had said, empires come with their machines, but the mountains remain. And we, like the mountains, would remain long after the Russians returned to their homeland, leaving behind their burned vehicles and buried dead as monuments to another empire that had learned the cost of invading Afghanistan. Captain Sergei Volkov, 29, 335th Independent Helicopter Regiment, Mi-24 pilot, born in Voronezh, Russian SFSR. The Mi-24 shuddered violently as I pulled back on the stick, the mountain ridgeline rushing toward us at 200 kilometers per hour. The altimeter spun wildly as we climbed, engines screaming against the thin mountain air. In the gunner's seat below and ahead of me, Leonid swore continuously into his oxygen mask. "RPG! 3 o'clock!" he shouted, the intercom crackling. With static, I banked hard right, throwing the 26,000-pound helicopter into an evasive maneuver that pressed me hard against my harness. The rocket-propelled grenade streaked past our port side, missing by meters. Through my tinted visor, I caught a glimpse of its fiery trail as it disappeared into the valley below. Target, rock formation, 2 o'clock, 300 meters. I called, bringing the helicopter level again. Light him up. Leonid rotated the turret, the 12.7mm Yakushev-Borzov 4-barrel machine gun tracking smoothly. The weapon erupted, sending a stream of tracers into the rocks where the RPG had originated. Stone fragments exploded, outward as the heavy rounds impacted. Behind us, the 3 other Mi-24s in our flight maintained formation, their silhouettes menacing against the stark blue Afghan sky. Below, obscured by swirling dust, 8 Mi-8 transports descended toward the landing zone, each carrying a squad of motor rifle infantry. "Bogies on the ridge," crackled the voice of Major Kuznetsov from the lead helicopter. "All Vulture. Units, commence suppression fire. Protect the transports." I nudged the collective, gaining altitude to position for another attack run. The irony wasn't lost on me. Our multi-million ruble aircraft, the pinnacle of Soviet military technology, hunting men with decades-old rifles who move through these mountains like ghosts. "Vulture 3, engaging," I responded, turning the helicopter toward the new threat. As I lined up the approach, I glimpsed the tiny figures scattering across the ridgeline. Mujahideen fighters recognizable by their pakols and loose clothing, carrying weapons that looked like toys from our altitude. The helicopter's shadow raced across the rocks toward them, a dark harbinger of the metal storm that followed. 9 months earlier, I had been flying training missions over the forests. Near Torzhok when the deployment orders came, Afghanistan wasn't unexpected. The 40th Army had been fighting there for 2 years already, and helicopter units rotated through on 6-month deployments. What surprised me was the urgency. "The situation is deteriorating," Colonel Baranov told our assembled air crews. "The Mujahideen are receiving increased support from Pakistan and the Americans. New weapons, better training. We're shipping out in 72 hours. My navigator and gunner, Senior Lieutenant Leonid Kharkov, nudged me with his elbow. "So much for your wedding leave," he whispered. He was right. Irina and I had planned to marry during my scheduled leave the following month. Instead, I wrote her a letter that night, promising to return safely. It was the first of many such promises I would make during the war. Our unit, 12 Mi-24V attack helicopters and support personnel, deployed to Kandahar Airfield in Sairiwe, southern Afghanistan in March 1982. The base sprawled across the desert like an industrial scar, concrete runways, prefabricated hangars, defensive positions ringed with concertina wire. The air shimmered with heat even in early spring, a preview of the summer inferno to come. Operations briefing on our first morning established the reality we faced. Major Kuznetsov, our flight leader, pointed to a topographical map of Zabul province. The 70th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade is conducting operations in these valleys. He indicated a series of parallel ravines cutting through mountainous terrain. Mujahideen forces have established strongholds in these villages, using the mountains for cover and staging ambushes along supply routes. He tapped several mountain passes marked with red circles. Our mission is to provide close air support for ground forces, conduct armed reconnaissance and escort transport helicopters during insertion and extraction operations. The Major paused, his weathered face grave. "The terrain will be your first enemy. Mountains up to 4,000 meters, thin air that reduces engine performance and lift, extreme temperature variations that affect fuel consumption and weapon systems, unpredictable wind patterns that can throw you into a mountainside if you're not vigilant." He switched to a different map showing known Mujahideen positions. Yorimo. Second enemy is increasingly well equipped. They have DSHK heavy machine guns positioned at strategic elevations. They have RPGs that can reach out to 500 meters. Intelligence suggests they may soon have access to anti-aircraft missiles supplied by the Americans. Leonid leaned toward me again. "Welcome to the graveyard of empires," he muttered. Our first combat mission came the following day. We were tasked with escorting a flight of Mi-8s transporting a motor rifle company to a landing zone near a suspected Mujahideen stronghold. The operation seemed straightforward on the map. A 30-minute flight, insertion of troops, provision of close air support as they secured the village, then extraction. Reality proved more complex. The mountains loomed like jagged teeth as we approached the area of operations. Our flight of 4 Mi-24s flew in a loose diamond formation, maintaining 180 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 150 meters. Behind us, 8 Mi-8 transports followed, their cargo bays filled with 30 soldiers each. Vulture flight approached from heading 045, confirm visual on landing zone. Major Kuznetsov's voice directed through the radio. Vulture 1, copy, I responded mechanically, scanning the terrain ahead. The landing zone was a small plateau alongside a mountain stream, approximately 2 kilometers from the target village. Seemingly ideal on the map, but in person, I immediately noted the surrounding high ground, perfect positions for ambush. I keyed my intercom. Leonid, I don't like this. Too many elevated positions overlooking the LZ. Those mountain ridges could hide an entire battalion, he agreed. Want me to switch to thermal? Affirmative. As Leonid activated the thermal imaging system, I felt the subtle vibration that always accompanied the Mi-24 at cruise speed. Despite its fearsome appearance and firepower, the helicopter had its vulnerabilities. The transmission was known to overheat. The tail rotor was susceptible to damage. And in these mountains, our engine strained against the thin air, reducing lift and responsiveness. Movement detected, Leonid reported. Ridge to the northeast, multiple heat signatures. Distance approximately 800 meters from the LZ. I relayed the information to Major Kuznetsov, who directed 2 helicopters to investigate while the remainder of the flight approached the landing zone. The first shots came as the Mi-8s began their descent. Muzzle flashes erupted from positions concealed among the rocks. The distinctive report of DSHK heavy machine guns echoed across the valley as 12.7mm rounds sought our aircraft. Taking fire, shouted one of the Mi-8 pilots. Multiple positions, 9 o'clock. Vulture flight, engage, ordered Kuznetsov calmly. Suppression fire, all weapons free. I banked toward the threat, bringing our weapon systems to bear. The Mi-24 carried formidable armament, the nose-mounted 4-barrel machine gun, 57mm rocket pods on stub wings, and in this configuration, 4 9M114 Sturm anti-tank guided missiles. Target acquired, Leonid confirmed. Firing. The helicopter shuddered as the machine gun opened up, sending 12.7mm rounds toward the enemy positions. Simultaneously, I triggered a salvo of rockets, which streaked toward the mountainside in fiery contrails. The impact sent debris and dust skyward as we pulled up and away, already lining up for another attack run. Below us, the Mi-8s were touching down in the landing zone, soldiers pouring from their side doors into defensive positions. One helicopter took hits to its tail boom, the pilot fighting to maintain control as he lifted off again. The radio filled with terse communications, position reports, damage assessments. For the next 30 minutes, we executed a deadly aerial ballet, diving to attack identified enemy positions, climbing to avoid return fire, circling to protect the exposed ground forces. The Mi-24's engines protested against the constant demands, temperature gauges edging into the caution zone as we maneuvered aggressively in the thin mountain air. 3 hours later, we returned to Kandahar, our ammunition depleted, fuel reserves low. The operation was deemed a tactical success, the village secured, weapons caches discovered, several Mujahideen fighters captured or killed. But as we conducted post-flight inspections, I counted 17 bullet holes in our airframe. 2 helicopters required major repairs before they could fly again. That night, I wrote to Irina, describing the stark beauty of the mountains but omitting the details of combat. Some experiences couldn't be shared, even with those we loved most. The weeks blurred together as operations continued. We provided close air support for convoys moving through mountain passes. We conducted reconnaissance flights over suspected enemy positions. We inserted special forces teams into remote valleys and extracted them days later, often under fire. Each mission reinforced the paradox of our situation. We possessed overwhelming technological superiority, aircraft that could rain destruction. From above, night vision capabilities, radio communications, precision weapons. Yet the Mujahideen held distinct advantages: intimate knowledge of the terrain, support from local populations, and the ability to choose when and where to fight. Midsummer, the operational tempo had increased dramatically. The 70th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade was conducting a major offensive against Mujahideen strongholds in the mountains northeast of Kandahar. Our helicopter regiment provided constant support, flying 3 or 4 combat missions daily. Though physical toll was immense, cockpit temperatures often exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. The constant vibration and noise induced fatigue that sleep could never fully dispel. The psychological strain was worse: the hypervigilance required to avoid ground fire, the responsibility of supporting ground troops who depended on our firepower, the knowledge that a moment's inattention could be fatal. In early August, intelligence reported a significant Mujahideen force gathering in the Arghandab Valley. The 70th Brigade planned a major operation to engage and destroy this concentration before it could disperse into the mountains. Our role was to insert 3 companies of motor rifle infantry into blocking positions, while ground forces advanced from the south. The mission briefing was detailed, the plan seemingly comprehensive. Yet as we prepared our aircraft before dawn on August 12th, I felt an undefined apprehension. Something about the operation felt wrong. "You're quiet this morning," Leonid observed as we conducted pre-flight checks. "Intelligence says the Mujahideen have at least 200 fighters concentrated in this valley," I replied, running my hand along the helicopter's composite armor plating. "When have they ever massed in such numbers? It's not their style." Leonid Hinds shrugged. "Maybe they're getting bolder. Or maybe the Americans are advising new tactics." The Americans. Their presence remained largely invisible, but their influence was increasingly evident. Newer weapons appearing in Mujahideen hands, more sophisticated tactics, better coordination. The conflict was becoming a proxy war, with Afghan fighters serving as the instrument of American opposition to Soviet presence. We lifted off at 0530, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten. Our flight of 4 Mi-24s accompanied 12 Mi-8 transports carrying the infantry companies. The plan called for insertion at 3 separate landing zones, creating a horseshoe of blocking positions around the suspected enemy concentration. The valleys appeared peaceful in the early morning light. Terraced fields clung to the lower slopes of mountains that soared to snow-capped peaks. Small villages nestled in protected hollows, their mud brick structures blending with the earth. It was difficult to reconcile this pastoral landscape with the reality of the war being fought across it. "Landing Zone Alpha in sight," reported Major Kuznetsov. "No visible activity. Beginning approach." Our formation separated, 2 Mi-24s, accompanying 4 Mi-8s toward the first landing zone. My flight continued with the remaining transports toward Landing Zone Bravo, a dry riverbed 2 kilometers farther north. The first indication of trouble came as the lead flight began. Their descent. Radio calls suddenly erupted, urgent and overlapping. "Taking fire! Heavy fire from the ridgeline! RPGs, multiple launchers. Vulture-1 is hit. Going down." I watched in horror as Major Kuznetsov's helicopter spiraled toward the valley floor, trailing black smoke. It impacted with a flash of orange flame, followed seconds later by a secondary explosion as its ammunition cooked off. "Abort insertion. All aircraft, abort," ordered the operation commander from his command post. "Withdraw to Rally Point Delta." But it was too late. The carefully planned operation had become a desperate fight for survival. The Mujahideen had anticipated our approach, preparing an elaborate ambush. Heavy machine guns and RPG teams were positioned on both sides of the valley, creating interlocking fields of fire. "Vulture 3, we're hit," called one of the Mi-8 pilots. "Hydraulic failure, controls sluggish. Request immediate cover for emergency landing." "Copy," I responded, banking toward the stricken transport. "Executing covering run." "Leonid, suppress those RPG positions at 2 o'clock. Our machine gun hammered as we dove toward the threat, followed by a salvo of rockets that detonated among the rocks. The Mi-8 descended awkwardly, fighting to maintain control as it approached the valley floor. For the next 45 minutes, we fought to protect the downed aircraft and its passengers. 2 more helicopters were hit, though both managed to limp back toward friendly territory. The radio filled with desperate calls for support, damage reports, casualty counts. When a rescue force finally arrived, BMD-1 airborne combat vehicles from the 103rd Guards Airborne Division, we had been flying continuous combat, maneuvers for nearly 2 hours. My arms ached from fighting the controls. Warning lights illuminated my instrument panel as systems approached their operational limits. Fuel gauges dipped toward reserves. As we finally turned for home, escorting the rescue force and the survivors from the downed aircraft, I surveyed the battlefield below. The wreckage of 3 helicopters smoldered on the valley floor. The bodies of Soviet soldiers lay where they had fallen. And already, the Mujahideen were melting away into the mountains, carrying their wounded and their captured weapons. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from Irina. She was still waiting, she wrote, still planning our life together after my return. I read it in the maintenance hangar while supervising repairs to our helicopter. 37 bullet holes, patched. A new transmission installed. Rotor blades balanced and inspected for damage. The contrast was stark. Her world of civilian concerns and future plans against my daily reality of mechanical limitations and survival calculations. Each existed in parallel, separated not just by thousands of kilometers but by experiences that could never be fully communicated. By October, rumors circulated that American-supplied Stinger missiles had reached Mujahideen units. These shoulder-launched weapons could track aircraft heat signatures, potentially reaching altitudes of 3,500 meters. Our technological advantage, the ability to attack from above with relative impunity, faced its most serious challenge. We adapted our tactics, flying at extremely low altitudes to avoid detection, using terrain masking, approaching targets from unexpected directions. The strain increased exponentially as we pushed both machines and men to their limits. On my final mission before rotation home, we escorted a convoy through the mountain passes northwest of Kandahar. The terrain forced us to fly predictable routes through narrow valleys, exactly the scenario we had trained to avoid. Movement, ridgeline 10 o'clock, Leonid reported tersely. Possible launch position. Before I could react, a flash appeared on the mountainside. The distinctive smoke trail of a missile arced toward us with terrifying speed. I slammed the collective down and banked hard right, deploying flares as we dove toward the valley floor. The helicopter protested, airframe groaning under the strain. The missile detonated somewhere behind us, close enough that shrapnel pinged against our tail boom. Stinger, Leonid confirmed unnecessarily. They're tracking us. For the remainder of the mission, we flew nap of the earth, skimming, just meters above the ground, using every fold in the terrain for concealment. The primitive landscape dictated our movement, negating the advantages of our advanced aircraft. It was a perfect metaphor for the entire conflict. Technological superiority constrained by geography, and an enemy that refused to fight on our terms. 3 days later, I boarded an An-12 transport for the flight home, my tour complete. Leonid remained behind, assigned to a new pilot for his final month. We said goodbye with few words. What needed to be said had been communicated during hundreds of hours in the confined space of the cockpit. As the transport climbed away from Kandahar, I watched the mountains recede beneath us. From this altitude, they seemed almost peaceful, their harsh realities softened by distance. No traces of war were visible, no burned vehicles along the roads, no bomb craters in the fields, no downed helicopters in the valleys. I thought about the paradox we had lived for 6 months. Our Mi-24s represented the pinnacle of Soviet military technology: composite armor, counter-rotating rotors, integrated weapon systems, night vision capabilities. Yet we had found ourselves engaged in a struggle against men armed with weapons designed decades earlier. Men who traveled on foot or horseback, who navigated by landmarks rather than GPS, who communicated by messenger rather than radio. Their primitive methods had proven remarkably effective against our technological advantages. Our very sophistication had in some ways become a vulnerability, complex systems requiring maintenance, specialized training, and extensive logistical support. I married Irina 2 weeks after returning home. During the ceremony, my thoughts drifted briefly to Afghanistan, to Leonid and the others still flying those mountains. The contrast between the peaceful church in Voronezh and the violent skies over Kandahar could not have been greater. After a time, I stopped writing to my former squad mates. I stopped watching news reports about the conflict. I focused on building a life detached from the war. But in dreams, I still fly those mountain valleys, the Mi-24 responding to my commands, Leonid's voice in my headset, the landscape simultaneously beautiful and deadly below us. Modern warfare's ultimate irony is this: all our technological achievement, our industrial capacity, our scientific advancement, confronted by the enduring human elements of courage, determination, and intimate knowledge of the land. In Afghanistan, that confrontation played out daily in the cockpits of our helicopters, machines of incredible complexity fighting against the most fundamental forces of geography and human will. Captain Viktor Leonidovich Morozov, 31, 335th Independent Helicopter Regiment, born in URSS. The rotor wash kicked up a blinding cloud of dust mixed with blood as we descended toward the clearing. Aggressive descent! Aggressive descent! Gennady screamed through the intercom as tracer rounds ripped through the air around us. The Mi-24 shuddered as rounds struck our armor plating. Below I could make out the prone forms of wounded VDV paratroopers, their commanding officer frantically waving an orange signal panel. Bodies lay scattered across the landing zone, some moving, many still. The door gunner was already firing, his PKT machine gun hammering at muzzle flashes from the ridgeline. My hands moved automatically across the controls, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. This was our third medevac mission in 18 hours. The helicopter's deck was still slick with blood from the previous extraction. As we touched down, I saw a paratrooper dragging his comrade toward us, the wounded man's leg dangling by sinew and bone. I focused on the horizon, on maintaining stability, on the mission. But somewhere deep inside, something was breaking, something that would never fully heal. They called us Angels of Death, an ironic nickname since we were there to save lives, not take them. But I suppose the Afghans saw it differently. To them, the distinctive silhouette of an Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter meant only one thing: death from above. What they didn't see were the times we flew without weapons to make room for the wounded, becoming not harbingers of death, but its adversaries. I was Captain Viktor Leonidovich Morozov, pilot with the 335th Independent Helicopter Regiment, and by April 1985, I had flown 187 combat missions in Afghanistan. Originally, we'd been deployed as attack helicopter crews, but as casualties mounted, our mission profile expanded. Our Mi-24s became dual-purpose gunships and medevac transports. The Mi-8s couldn't survive the hot zones anymore, too vulnerable to the American Stingers that were flooding in through Pakistan. Our Hinds, with their armored cockpits and bellies, became the only reliable way to get the wounded out. My crew consisted of 4 men, myself as pilot, Major Gennady Kuznetsov as weapons systems officer, Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov as flight engineer, and Sergeant Pavel Nemov as door gunner. We had been flying together for 14 months. We no longer needed words to communicate during operations. A grunt, a gesture, a shift in breathing was enough. We were stationed at Bagram Airfield, the largest Soviet airbase in Afghanistan. Our days followed a grim pattern: wake at 500, briefing at 530, in the air by 600, then mission after mission until fuel, ammunition, or daylight ran out. Sometimes, if the situation was desperate enough, we flew at night too, though the risk of crashing in the mountains or flying into an ambush increased tenfold. The morning of April 17 began like any other. Breakfast was black tea and bread, followed by a mission briefing with Colonel Baranov, our squadron commander. "Comrades, we have a situation in the Panjshir Valley," he said, pointing to a map. A company from the 103rd Guards Airborne Division was ambushed near this village. Heavy casualties reported. The area is hot. Multiple DSHK heavy machine guns on the ridge lines, possible stingers. Need immediate extraction of wounded. Gennady studied the map, his face impassive. Narrow valley, high ridges on both sides. Perfect kill zone. Colonel Baranov nodded. That's why we're sending you. 2 Hinds. Yours for medevac, Petrov's for fire support. Get those boys out. Wheels up in 20 minutes. Outside the briefing room, Dmitri was already pre-fighting our helicopter, methodically checking systems. Pavel was loading the PKT machine gun that would provide covering fire from the side door during extraction. Bad one? Dmitri asked, seeing my expression. Panjshir Valley, Dushman country. He nodded grimly. The Panjshir was controlled by Ahmad Shah Massoud, the most effective Mujahideen commander in Afghanistan. His fighters were disciplined, well-equipped with Pakistani and American weapons, and knew the terrain intimately. They called Massoud the Lion of Panjshir. We called him other things. We lifted off at 622, our Mi-24, heavy with extra medical supplies but lighter on ammunition to make room for casualties. Captain Petrov's Hind flew alongside us, loaded with rockets and ammunition to suppress enemy fire during the extraction. The morning sun had just cleared the Hindu Kush mountains, casting long shadows across the valleys below. The radio crackled. Vol.5, this is Crimson 6. We have approximately 9 wounded requiring immediate evacuation, 3 critical, taking sporadic fire from the northeast ridgeline. LZ is marked with orange panels. Be advised, we've spotted Mujahideen with stingers 2 kilometers east of our position. Copy that, Crimson 6, I responded. ETA 8 minutes. Prepare wounded for immediate loading. Gennady was already plotting approach and exit routes on his kneeboard map. We should come in from the south, below the ridgeline. Use the terrain to mask our approach until the last moment. I nodded. Relay to Petrov. Tell him to prepare for suppression fire on the northeast ridge as we make our approach. The landscape below us was breathtaking in its harsh beauty. Jagged. Mountains rising from narrow green valleys where farmers had cultivated terraced fields for centuries. It was difficult to reconcile such beauty with the brutality of the war being fought across it. As we approached the Panjshir, the radio came alive with chatter from the paratroopers on the ground. They were taking increased fire. One of their critically wounded had just died. Time was running out for the others. 2 minutes out, I announced. Pavel, prepare for immediate loading once we touch down. Dmitri, keep the engine spooled hot. We're not staying longer than 30 seconds. Petrov's voice came over the radio. Vol.5, we'll begin our attack run in 60 seconds. Be ready to follow us in. Good luck, Victor. His Hind banked sharply and descended toward the northeast ridgeline, rockets launching in rippling salvos. The explosions walked up the rocky slope where the Mujahideen had established firing positions. I could see tracer rounds arcing up from the ground as the fighters returned fire. Now, Gennady shouted, and I pushed the collective down, sending our Hind into a steep descent toward the clearing where orange panels marked the landing zone. The paratroopers had established a perimeter, firing outward to suppress enemy positions as we came in. The rotor wash kicked up a blinding cloud of dust mixed with blood as we descended. Aggressive descent! Aggressive descent! Gennady screamed as tracer rounds ripped through the air around us. The helicopter shuddered as rounds struck our armor plating. We hit the ground hard and Pavel slid the door open, immediately firing his PKT at muzzle flashes from the ridgeline. Paratroopers rushed forward with the wounded, passing them up into the helicopter's cargo compartment. The floor was quickly covered with bleeding men, some conscious and screaming, others ominously silent. 10 seconds, I called out, keeping the engines at full power, ready for immediate takeoff. Taking fire from the west now, Gennady warned as new tracer rounds began arcing toward us from another position. Petrov's Hind was already engaging, his 30mm cannon thumping rhythmically as it sent explosive rounds into the new threat. That's all of them, Pavel shouted as the last wounded paratrooper was dragged aboard. Go, go, go! I yanked the collective, and the Hind leaped skyward, banking hard to the south to put the ridge between us and the enemy fire. The sudden movement elicited screams of pain from the wounded in the compartment behind me. Dmitri, status, I called. 7 wounded aboard. 2 critical. Pavel is applying tourniquets. We took approximately 15 hits, but all systems operational. Petrov, we're clear with the wounded. Cover our exit. Copy that. We'll keep them busy. Get those boys home." We thundered down the valley. At treetop level, using the terrain to mask us from potential stinger teams, the wounded groaned and cursed with every jolt and turn. Pavel and Dmitri moved among them, applying pressure bandages, starting IVs with morphine, doing what they could in the cramped, vibrating confines of the helicopter. One of the wounded, a lieutenant with his arm shredded by shrapnel, looked up at me from the floor. "The others?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Captain Petrov is covering them," I replied. "Another evacuation flight is inbound." He nodded and closed his eyes, his face gray with blood loss and shock. We reached Bagram Airfield 23 minutes later. Medical teams rushed forward. As we landed, transferring the wounded to stretchers and rushing them to the field hospital. As they worked, we remained in the helicopter, rotors still turning. There was no time to shut down. More wounded needed extraction. The deck crew refueled us as medical orderlies hosed blood from the cargo compartment floor. Dmitri restocked our medical supplies while Pavel reloaded his machine gun. 47 minutes after landing, we were airborne again, heading back to the Panjshir. That day, we flew 4 extraction missions, each more desperate than the last. By sunset, we had evacuated 22 wounded paratroopers. 5 died either in our helicopter or shortly after reaching the field hospital. Our Hind had taken 38 hits from small arms fire. 1 round had penetrated the cockpit, passing between Gennady and me before embedding in a radio panel. After the final mission, we sat in silence in the officers' mess, too exhausted to speak, too wired to sleep. Petrov's crew joined us. They had flown continuous suppression missions, expending all their rockets and cannon ammunition covering the evacuations. "Did you see that last group we pulled out?" Pavel finally said, breaking the silence. The young one with half his face. "Gone. Couldn't have been more than 19. "Don't," Gennady said sharply. "Just don't." But Pavel continued, his voice hollow. "I keep seeing them. When I close my eyes, all of them. The ones we saved, the ones we didn't." I understood. We all did. After enough missions, the faces blurred together, a gallery of pain, fear, and mortality that visited in dreams and quiet moments. Doctors called it combat stress reaction. The men called it the Afghan shakes, or valley fever. Whatever the name, it changed. We got them out," I said. "Focus on that." 2 days later, we received word that the paratrooper company had been extracted from the Panjshir. Of 47 men who had been ambushed, 31 survived. Massoud's fighters had withdrawn deeper into the valley. Another inconclusive engagement in a war full of them. That night I wrote a letter to my wife in Ryazan. I told her about the weather, about a film shown in the officers' club, about mundane things that had nothing to do with blood-slicked helicopter decks or the eyes of dying men. I didn't tell her about the tremor in my hands that appeared some days, or how I flinched at sudden noises, or the dreams that jerked me awake, drenched in sweat. By the end of my tour in November 1985, I had flown 341 combat missions and evacuated 204 wounded soldiers. I received the Order of the Red Star and a promotion to Major. The official citation mentioned courage under fire and saving numerous lives under extremely adverse conditions. What it didn't mention was the cost. When I returned to the Soviet Union, I brought something back with me, something invisible but as real as shrapnel. The doctors had clinical terms for it: post-traumatic stress disorder, combat fatigue. But among veterans, we simply called it the Afghan syndrome. It manifested in different ways. For some, it was rage that erupted without warning. For others, emotional numbness or crippling anxiety. For me, it was the dreams and a constant gnawing hypervigilance, a sense that death was always moments away. I would find myself planning escape routes from restaurants, counting potential threats on public transportation, startling at backfiring cars or slamming doors. My wife noticed first. "You're here," she said one night, touching my chest. But not here, touching my head. She was right. Part of me remained in Afghanistan, flying endless missions over mountains that didn't care, evacuating young men whose names I never knew, their blood soaking into my helicopter's deck. The Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, declaring victory while leaving behind a land essentially unconquered. Many said it was our Vietnam, a superpower, humbled by primitive fighters with superior motivation. Perhaps they were right. For those of us who served there, Afghanistan was never truly left behind. It lived in our memories, our nightmares, our damaged relationships, our survivors' guilt. Some coped with vodka, others with work. Some couldn't cope at all. I continued flying, transferring to civil aviation after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The routine of pre-flight checks, the precise dance of controls, the focus required, these things helped quiet the ghosts, but they never fully disappeared. Years later, I met one of the paratroopers I had evacuated. He recognized me at a veterans gathering in Moscow. "You flew the Hind," he said. "Panjshir Valley, 85. I nodded. "You saved my life," he said simply, and showed me a photograph of his family, a wife, 3 children. I looked at those faces, lives that existed because one day we had flown into hell to bring their future father home. And for a moment, the weight of the Afghan syndrome lifted slightly. We didn't win that war. Perhaps no one could. But in those moments when we descended into fire to lift out the wounded, we won something more important. The right to look in the mirror and recognize the person staring back. Not all victories are recorded in history books. Some are measured only in the beats of a heart that might otherwise have been stilled, in the breath of a man who had nearly breathed his last, in children born to fathers who almost never came home. For a helicopter crew in a forgotten war, sometimes that has to be enough. Captain Leonid Kravchenko, 31, 335th Independent Helicopter Regiment, born in Kazan, Russia. The Mi-24V shuddered violently as I yanked the control stick hard to port, the massive gunship banking sharply between the jagged mountain walls. The radar warning receiver screamed in my headset. Stinger launch detected. My gunner, Sergeant Kozlov, swore as he triggered the UV-26 countermeasure system, sending cascades of infrared flares tumbling into the thin mountain air behind us. Through my peripheral vision, I caught the white smoke trail of the American-supplied missile as it tracked our heat signature, then veered away, seduced by the hotter burning flares. Less than 3 seconds later, a second launch alert blared through my headset. "2 more incoming, 3 o'clock high," Kozlov shouted. I pushed the throttle to maximum emergency power, feeling the twin Isotov turboshafts strain as I forced the 12-ton helicopter into a dive toward the valley floor, scraping less than 15 meters above the rocky terrain. The G-forces crushed me into my seat as I pulled up sharply, using the terrain to mask us from the tracking system of the Stinger. Behind us, one missile slammed into the mountainside, but the second continued its deadly pursuit. "Brace!" I shouted into the intercom, knowing we had less than 2 seconds before impact. 6 months earlier, December 1985. The briefing room at Bagram Air Base was frigid despite the electric heaters running at full capacity. Outside, the Hindu Kush mountains were covered in snow, their peaks disappearing into gray winter clouds. 20 helicopter crews sat in silence as Major Gorshkov outlined our next operation. "Comrades, we are conducting a major air assault into the Panjshir Valley," he announced, pointing to the map with a wooden stick. "The 345th Guards Airborne Regiment will be inserted at these 3 landing zones. Our Mi-8s will deliver the troops while the Mi-24 squadrons provide close air support and suppress enemy positions." I studied the topographical map carefully. The Panjshir Valley was notorious, a narrow corridor of death where Soviet helicopters had been lost at an alarming rate. The valley's steep walls created natural channels that limited our maneuverability and provided perfect firing positions for Mujahideen anti-aircraft weapons. Intelligence reports that the rebels have received new shipments of American Stinger missiles, Gorshkov continued, his voice grave. These are not the SA-7 copies we faced before. These are fire-and-forget weapons with much higher accuracy. Stay above 1,500 meters whenever possible, use terrain masking, and deploy countermeasures liberally. My gunner and technician, Sergeant Dmitry Kozlov, sat beside me taking notes. We had flown together for 14 months, completing 68 combat missions. Both of us had seen enough helicopters go down to know that survival in Afghanistan was as much about luck as skill. Captain Kravchenko, Major Gorshkov called out, "Your flight will lead the second wave. You'll be responsible for clearing. Landing zone Bravo here." He pointed to a small plateau halfway up the valley. "Yes, Comrade Major," I replied. "What intelligence do we have on the defensive positions?" "DSHK heavy machine guns here and here." He indicated 2 points on the ridgeline, possibly a ZPU-1 at the northern approach. "Standard doctrine applies. Suppress from maximum range, then circle in to destroy as the infantry advances." After the briefing, Kozlov and I walked to our barracks to prepare. The wooden building was little protection against the bitter Afghan winter, and we could see our breath inside. "Another fun trip to the Panjshir," Kozlov said sarcastically as he pulled out his flight suit. At 27, he was 4 years my junior, but already had the weathered face of a veteran. "You know what they call it, right? The Valley of Five Lions, or as we call it, the Valley of Dead Russians. Save the fatalism for after the mission," I replied, checking my personal weapon, a Soviet APS underwater pistol that many helicopter pilots carried for its compact size. "We stick to the plan, maintain altitude, and watch for ambush points. The plan always works until the first shot," he muttered, an old saying among helicopter crews. At 0400 the next morning, we gathered on the flight line for final preparations. The pre-dawn air was brutally cold, around -15 Celsius, making every metal surface painful to touch with bare hands. Our Mi-24V Hind, tail number Yellow 24, sat on the tarmac, its massive silhouette resembling a prehistoric beast in the darkness. The ground crew had worked through the night, loading 12.7mm ammunition for the 4-barreled Yak-B Gatling gun, S-8 rocket pods, and 4 AT-6 spiral anti-tank guided missiles. Our flight engineer, Senior Sergeant Nikolai Baranov, was completing the pre-flight checks as we approached. "Systems operational, Captain," he reported. "Fuel tanks full, weapons armed, countermeasures loaded. The left engine is running a bit hot, but within parameters." I nodded, trusting his assessment. Baranov had been maintaining Mi-24s since they first arrived in Afghanistan in 1979. He knew every bolt and wire in the aircraft. "We're number 2 in the takeoff sequence," I told them, checking my watch. Wheels up at 0445. The startup procedure was second nature after hundreds of missions. The twin turboshafts whined as they came to life, the massive 5-blade main rotor beginning its rotation, slowly at first, then accelerating to a blur that created the distinctive heavy chop of the Mi-24. Through my headset, I could hear the other helicopters reporting their status to the tower. "Bagram Tower, Yellow 24 ready for departure," I transmitted when our turn came. "Yellow 24, cleared for takeoff. Maintain heading 045, climb to 2,000 meters." I pulled collective and eased the cyclic forward, feeling the helicopter lighten as it broke free from gravity. The Mi-24 was a beast, heavily armored and weighing over 12 tons fully loaded, but it handled with surprising agility once airborne. We joined the formation of 8 Mi-24s and 12 Mi-8s, arranging ourselves in a combat spread as we headed northeast toward the Panjshir. Dawn was breaking as we approached the valley, the first rays of sunlight illuminating the snow-covered peaks. The temperature at our altitude was -25 Celsius, and ice had formed on the edges of the windscreen despite the heating system. Below us, the landscape was a treacherous maze of ridges, valleys, and peaks, much of it unexplored by any Soviet forces. 10 minutes to target," I announced over the intercom. "Weapons hot. Kozlov, begin your scan." "Roger that," he replied from the gunner's position in the nose compartment below and ahead of me. From there, he controlled the Yak-B cannon and could guide the AT-6 missiles using the optical sight. The radio crackled. "All units, Falcon Lead. Enemy position spotted at the valley entrance. Engaging now. Ahead I could see the lead Mi-24 diving toward the valley floor, rocket pods flashing as it launched S-8s toward suspected Mujahideen positions. The unguided rockets created plumes of dust and smoke as they impacted the rocky terrain. Yellow 24, this is Condor 6, came the voice of the airborne commander in one of the Mi-8s. LZ Bravo needs clearing. Multiple DSHK positions firing on our approach. Copy Condor 6. Yellow 24 engaging now. I banked the helicopter sharply and descended to 1,800 meters, still high enough to stay outside the effective range of most small arms fire. Through the targeting system, I could see muzzle flashes on the ridgeline above our designated landing zone. I have visual on 3, maybe 4 heavy machine gun positions, Kozlov reported. Targeting the northernmost first. Cleared 2. Engage! The helicopter shuddered slightly as Kozlov fired an AT-6 spiral missile. The wire-guided weapon streaked toward the target, leaving a thin contrail as it covered the 2 kilometers in seconds. The explosion sent debris and what looked like body parts flying into the air. Direct hit, Kozlov confirmed. Moving to the next target. We continued our deadly work, systematically eliminating the defensive positions around the landing zone. The Mi-24 was designed precisely for this role, a flying tank that could absorb punishment while delivering devastating firepower. I maintained a circular flight path, giving Kozlov clear firing angles while minimizing our exposure to return fire. After neutralizing the most obvious threats, we descended to 800 meters for a closer scan of the landing zone. This was always the most dangerous phase, low enough to be vulnerable to small arms fire, but necessary to ensure the Mi-8s could safely land with their cargo of paratroopers. The first transport helicopter was beginning its approach when I spotted a flash from a cave entrance on the eastern slope. RPG! 3 o'clock! I shouted, banking hard to evade. The rocket-propelled grenade passed behind us, missing by less than 20 meters. Kozlov immediately responded, raking the cave entrance with the Yak-B cannon. The 12.7mm rounds chewed into the rock face at 4,000 rounds per minute, silencing the position. LZ looks clear, I reported after another sweep. Condor 6, you are cleared to land. The Mi-8s descended in sequence, hovering momentarily before touching down on the plateau. Paratroopers from the 345th poured out, taking defensive positions as they secured the landing zone. The operation was proceeding according to plan. A rarity in this war. That's when everything changed. Missile launch! Missile launch! The warning came from one of the other Mi-24 pilots. Stingers confirmed. I immediately pulled maximum power, climbing rapidly while deploying countermeasures. Through my canopy, I could see one of our Mi-8s trailing smoke, its right engine hit by a Stinger. The pilot was struggling to maintain control as he limped toward the relative safety of the landing zone. Yellow 24, multiple launchers on the western ridge, came. The frantic call from our command helicopter. Can you suppress? Moving to engage, I replied, banking toward the reported position. The western ridge was a perfect firing position for the Mujahideen, high ground with numerous caves and rock formations for cover. As we approached, I could see muzzle flashes and the occasional white smoke trail of launching missiles. Range 1,500 meters, Kozlov reported. Deploying rockets, he fired a salvo of S-8 rockets that impacted across the ridgeline, creating a rolling series of explosions. Without waiting to assess damage, I pushed the helicopter into a shallow dive, giving Kozlov a clean firing solution with the cannon. Yak-B roared to life, its distinctive sound reverberating through the airframe as it spat out 12.7mm rounds at a tremendous rate. I could see the rounds walking across the rocky terrain, suppressing the missile teams if not killing them outright. We're taking fire from both sides now, I warned as tracers streaked past our canopy from another position. The Mujahideen had set up a crossfire, a tactic they'd perfected over years of fighting Soviet helicopters. I jinked the helicopter randomly, making us a harder target while still maintaining enough stability for Kozlov to return fire. The Mi-24's armor could stop small arms fire, but heavy machine guns would tear through it, not to mention the deadly Stingers. Missile launch! Missile launch! Our warning system blared again. I executed a sharp diving turn, simultaneously deploying flares. The G-forces pressed me into my seat as the horizon spun crazily in my canopy. The Stinger streaked past, missing us by meters. That was too close, Kozlov muttered, his voice tight with tension. We continued to circle the battlefield, providing cover as the Mi-8s completed their deliveries of troops and equipment. 2 more helicopters had taken damage, one limping back to base with an engine fire, another forced to land at the LZ with hydraulic failure. Yellow 24, Condor 6. We need immediate support at grid reference 1542. Thwijk. Contact with enemy forces. The grid coordinates indicated a position about 2 kilometers up the valley from the landing zone. The paratroopers had advanced into a prepared ambush. Copy Condor 6. En route now. I pushed the helicopter forward, hugging the southern wall of the valley for protection. As we approached the coordinates, the scene below was chaotic. Soviet paratroopers were pinned down behind rocks and in shallow depressions as heavy fire came from a fortified village. I could see the distinctive green uniforms of our troops as they attempted to maneuver under fire. Multiple targets in the village, Kozlov reported. Heavy machine gun in the tallest building, snipers on the rooftops, RPG teams moving between structures. Prioritize the heavy weapons, I instructed, setting up for an attack run. We came in from the east, using the rising sun to mask our approach. Kozlov fired 2 AT-6 missiles in rapid succession, destroying the building with the DSHK and another structure where RPG teams were gathered. I followed with a rocket run, the S-8s creating a wall of explosions along the village perimeter. As we pulled up from our attack run, something slammed into the tail boom with tremendous force. The helicopter lurched violently, warning lights flooding my instrument panel. "We're hit! We're hit!" Baranov shouted from his position. "Tail rotor damage, hydraulic pressure dropping." The controls suddenly became sluggish as partial hydraulic failure affected the flight systems. The Mi-24 began to yaw uncontrollably to the right as the tail rotor lost efficiency. "Mayday, Mayday. Yellow 24, hit and losing control," I transmitted, fighting the stick with both hands. Attempting emergency landing. The valley floor below was rocky and uneven, a terrible place for an emergency landing, but we had no choice. I struggled to maintain some semblance of control as we descended rapidly. My training took over. As I performed the emergency procedures by rote, reducing power, maintaining airspeed to avoid settling with power, selecting the least terrible landing spot available. "Brace for impact," I shouted as we approached the ground. The Mi-24 slammed down hard, the landing gear absorbing some of the impact before collapsing. We skidded across the rocky ground, the sound of tearing metal overwhelming as the lower fuselage was ripped open. The main rotor struck the ground, sending fragments of composite blades slicing through the air like guillotines. Finally, we came to rest on our side, the smell of fuel and hydraulic fluid filling the cockpit. "Kozlov, Baranov, report," I called out, hanging in my straps. "Alive," Kozlov grunted from his position. "Legs pinned but intact." "I'm good," Baranov replied, already unbuckling. "We need to get out before she burns." I released my harness, falling awkwardly against the side of the cockpit. My emergency extraction tool, essentially a small fire axe, was used to break through the canopy, which had cracked but not shattered on impact. The 3 of us crawled from the wreckage, Kozlov wincing as we freed his trapped leg. Less than 50 meters from our crash site, Soviet paratroopers were advancing toward us, providing covering fire as they came. The distinctive crack of AK-74s was reassuring after the terrifying silence of free fall. "Ironhawk 3, we have your crew," a young lieutenant radioed as his squad reached us. "Setting up defensive perimeter now." We took cover, behind the wreckage of our helicopter as the firefight continued around us. Within minutes, another Mi-24 appeared overhead, suppressing enemy positions with cannon fire, while an Mi-8 approached for extraction. "Yellow 24 crew, prepare for immediate evacuation," came the transmission from the Mi-8 pilot. The transport helicopter landed in a swirl of dust and rock chips, its rear ramp already lowering. Covered by the paratroopers, we sprinted for the Mi-8, Kozlov limping between Baranov and me. As soon as we were aboard, the pilot pulled maximum power, the helicopter leaping into the air as rounds pinged off its fuselage. From the open door, I watched our Mi-24 grow smaller as we gained altitude. A plume of black smoke began to rise from it, either from battle damage or deliberately set by the paratroopers to deny the Mujahideen any salvageable equipment. Either way, Yellow 24 had flown her last mission. Back at Bagram, the debriefing was somber. Our operation had achieved its objectives. The 345th Guards had established their positions in the valley, but at a heavy cost. 3 helicopters lost, 2 crewmen killed, 9 wounded. The Stingers are changing the equation, Major Gorshkov concluded after all reports were delivered. We can no longer operate with impunity at low altitudes. Effective immediately, all operations will maintain minimum altitude of 1,500 meters, unless absolutely necessary for the mission. That night, I sat alone in the officers' mess, a glass of vodka untouched before me. The events of the day played through my mind in an endless loop. The missile warnings, the impact, the sickening sensation of falling from the sky. Helicopter crews were a superstitious lot. Many carried talismans or performed personal rituals before flights. I had always dismissed such practices, trusting in training and technology instead. Now I wasn't so sure. Kozlov joined me, his leg bandaged but nothing broken. The tech crew salvaged the flight recorder, he said without preamble. It was an RPG that got us, not a Stinger. Old Soviet technology, not the fancy American. Missiles. He laughed humorlessly. Ironic, isn't it? I finally picked up my vodka and drank it in one swallow, feeling the burn down my throat. We got lucky. Luck is a finite resource, he replied. Eventually it runs out for everyone in this place. I looked at him, this man with whom I had faced death countless times, and saw the truth of Afghanistan reflected in his eyes. We were fighting a war that couldn't be won from the air, couldn't be won with technology alone. The mountains themselves were the enemy, ancient and unyielding, breaking helicopters and men with equal indifference. 2 days later, we were assigned a replacement helicopter, Yellow 36, and a new mission. The war continued, one valley at a time, one mission at a time, measured in the diminishing reserves of luck allocated to each helicopter crew. Some would make it home. Many would not. The Hindu Kush would keep their secrets, their wreckage, their bones. And somewhere in the Panjshir, our fallen helicopter lay as another monument to the folly of those who believed that mastery of the air could translate to victory on the unforgiving ground of Afghanistan.